Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so very, very much for joining us at this inaugural event. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. The Ann Arbor campus currently resides on land ceded through the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Additionally, in 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan, ceded through the Treaty of Fort Meigs, with the hope that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the sovereignty of tribal lands and the painful history of genocide, forced assimilation, and displacement of Native communities that facilitated the establishment of the university. We affirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land, the profound contributions of Native Americans to this institution, and the university's commitment to educate the children of Native ancestors. So, thank you so much for joining our inaugural Michigan Anthropology Four-Field Symposium. The purpose of the symposium is to convene a conversation across the four subfields of anthropology: archaeological, biological, linguistic, and sociocultural. Our selected theme for this year, Kinship, Humans and Beyond, stimulates reflection on a range of issues surrounding human relations, animal relations, and human-animal relations as researched in our respective fields, relations that touch on language, society, environment, biology, and material culture. There will be a total of 3 panel sessions this afternoon. The first panel, already assembled here on the stage, will feature Professor E. Summerson Carr, a linguistic anthropologist, and Professor Amy Clark, an anthropological archaeologist, and the panel will be moderated by our own Professor Raven Garvey. The second panel will feature Professor Kevin Langergraber, a biological anthropologist, and Professor Juno Salazar Pereñas, a sociocultural anthropologist, and will be moderated by our own Elisa Paredes, Professor Elisa Paredes. In the final session, all 4 speakers will come together in a roundtable discussion moderated by our own Professor Liz Roberts. We will have snacks available during the breaks between panels, and there will be a reception here in the ballroom immediately following our final session. So thank you, those present in the room and those on our live stream, for your participation in this event, which is inspired by a desire not to take four-field anthropology at face value, and instead see what can be generated and discovered by thinking with, alongside, and across and through the traditional subdivisions of our discipline. I also would like to thank our anthropology department staff, Michigan Media, and the Michigan Union Event staff for the incredible support and talent they have brought to making this event a success. So with that, let me turn over to our moderator, and let me introduce first Professor Raven Garvey. Professor Raven Garvey is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Anthropology, also Curator of High Latitude and Western North American Archaeology in the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, and she is a Senior Fellow of the Michigan Society of Fellows. Her field projects in Patagonia, southernmost South America, center on human ecology in the Andes and adjacent arid plains, and her laboratory projects are designed to help us better understand the effects of cultural transmission, who learns what from whom and how, on technological developments. She's just returned after a year's fellowship funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, during which she worked with aerospace engineers, exploring the effects of wind on past humans' livelihoods and technologies in Patagonia, one of the windiest places on Earth. Please welcome Professor Garvey.
Thank you, Kelly. And to echo Kelly's thanks to all of you for coming and to all those who have made this event possible. So I would like first to introduce our 2 speakers. I'll introduce them simultaneously. They'll each give their talks, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. E. Summerson Carr. Professor Carr is a sociocultural and linguistic anthropologist who conducts ethnographic studies of social work and allied professions. She's a University of Michigan alumna, having earned her PhD in anthropology and social work, as well as a Master's of Social Work, a Master's of Anthropology, and a graduate certificate in women's studies. She's now associate professor jointly appointed in social work and anthropology at the University of Chicago. Professor Carr's first book, titled Scripting Addiction, The Politics of Therapeutic Talk and American Sobriety, centers on drugs, addiction, and addiction treatment. And to quote from her website, the book traces the cultural and clinical history of American ideas about addiction and sobriety and examines how these ideas are put into play at a drug treatment program in the Midwestern United States. Professor Carr also co-edited a volume with our very own Michael Lempert. The book is called Scale, Discourse and Dimensions of Social Life, and it explores how, why, and under what circumstances social actors scale their worlds and the outcomes of such scaling. Professor Carr's current book project centers on canine-assisted therapy and seeks to understand how dogs in particular are trained and used in clinical and social service settings. This project reflects and articulates with her broader research interests, which include animal-human interaction and animal-assisted interventions, behavioral health, and psychotherapeutic interventions. And it's this work that she'll be sharing with us today in a talk titled Working Like a Dog, Canine Labor in U.S. Human Services. Our second speaker is Dr. Amy Clark. Professor Clark is an anthropological archaeologist whose work centers on foraging societies in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, predominantly in Eurasia and Africa. She earned her PhD from the University of Arizona and was subsequently awarded a Phison Foundation postdoctoral fellowship in Toulouse, France, a postdoctoral researcher position at the University of Oklahoma, and a college fellowship in Harvard's Department of Anthropology, where she is now faculty. Professor Clark has excavated sites and worked on materials from France, Israel, Turkey, Serbia, and most recently Morocco. She employs intrasite spatial analysis and lithic analysis to address questions related to the development of the home, human connectivity across landscapes, the spread of innovations, and human-environment interactions. Professor Clark is currently interested in how living spaces or homes engendered social learning and the formation of social bonds, thereby directing the course of human cognitive and behavioral evolution. She has an active field project in the Essaouira region of Morocco, where she's the director and research team member, respectively, of two Middle Stone Age sites, Jorf El Amam and Bismoun Cave. Through these projects, Professor Clark seeks to understand human connectivity across the Sahara Desert during climatic oscillations and variations in human adaptation within northwestern Africa. Today, she'll be sharing insights from and results of her research in a talk titled Friends, Foes, or Frenemies, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Other Archaic Humans on a Shared Landscape. Please join me in welcoming both Dr. Summerson Carr, E. Summerson Carr, and Dr. Amy Clark.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here today, back at my alma mater, and at this event in particular. This is really excellent timing for me, as I've just finished a year-long sabbatical, and I'm awash in field notes and interview transcripts and archival material, working to make sense of it all. So I'm eager to hear your questions and comments, and of course to hear the other speakers' papers, and I hope I'll start us off on a good foot here. Just when some of us humans have started to actively grapple with our lack of care for other species, we have also recompanioned those species to care for us in intensive and conventionally human ways. In the United States in particular, a belief is rapidly gaining ground. That is, that non-human animals can effectively tend to suffering in ways that humans, even those professionally trained in the human services, cannot. Indeed, faced with the alleged inadequacies of human services, North American advocates of animal-assisted therapies point to and invest in the extraordinary capacities of non-human animals to communicate with especially hard-to-reach, vulnerable human populations. an iconic therapy animal with an especially meritorious service history, the North American dog, is working an ever-widening service terrain: hospitals, courtrooms, programs for children with disabilities, nursing homes, special education classrooms, de-stressing events at universities, libraries, and literacy programs. The nurses, teachers, social workers, counselors, and other human service professionals who work alongside these dogs marvel at their therapeutic acumen and impact on their once recalcitrant clientele, as do the dog's human handlers. Take Phyllis and her late German Shepherd, Devon, who Phyllis describes as spiritually connected, almost telepathic in ways. A number of years ago, Phyllis and Devon went through a 4-week therapy dog training program and began to volunteer at a growing number of organizations that were becoming intently interested in dogs like Devon. On Devon's very first visit to a program with children with physical disabilities, the dog's keen therapeutic senses were soon on display when she identified the only 2 deaf-blind children in a crowded room and immediately gave them gentle licks to alert them to her presence. Later, the pair began visiting a residential program for teenage girls, where Devon again showed her knack for identifying the neediest humans. As Phyllis tells it, on one weekly visit to the program, Devon became laser-focused on a girl who refused to participate in gym time, sitting on the sidelines, arms folded around her knees, head tucked in as if hiding, rebuffing interaction with paid program staff. Phyllis says, so Devon just goes over there and just sits down and leans. German Shepherds have this leaning thing, and leans into the girl. She puts her arm around the dog and starts crying. And I'm not asking anything. I don't do verbal therapy. It's the dog, right? So I just let Devon do. Alerted now to the now sobbing girl, a human staff member approached to see how she could help. But according to Phyllis, it was not to the human professional, but rather to the dog, that the girl finally whispered that her grandma had died that day. How did Devon know? Phyllis rhetorically asked me. She did. Such enchanting accounts of canine-assisted therapy undoubtedly help fuel the spread of it, a trend that shows no sign of abating. Phyllis is now a trainer in and head of the board of a grassroots organization that trains and deploys dog handler pairs to several hundred social service organizations in a major metropolitan area. Dogs like Devon typically work only a few hours a week on what we might call tentatively a volunteer basis, accompanying their human family members to service sites and otherwise living the leisurely life of an average middle-class American dog. I've followed several such dogs from their training to their service work over the past 2 years. However, the primary focus of my research has been dogs who are specifically bred and rigorously trained for the first 2 years of their life to work full-time in social service, judicial, and medical facilities. This is the case for Hoover, an English lab, who has spent the last 6 years on the staff of a county judicial center, spending 40 hours a week rotating between a drug court, a mental health court, and a juvenile detention center. For Jack, a younger lab who is still learning the ropes at a rehabilitation hospital where he assists with physical, occupational, and speech therapy. And Hal, a golden retriever who works 9 to 5, 5 days a week at a children's advocacy center. All of these dogs, who I'm lucky to count among my interlocutors, work with trained human handlers at their respective service sites, which itself requires a great deal of interspecies coordination. This is quite aside from the hundreds of hours of work of breeding, whelping, and training that prepares these dogs for a life of service. Training that, by the way, not only involves professional kennel staff and canine trainers, but also pools of well-heeled community-based puppy raisers and inmates at federal prisons. To be sure, the rapid growth of canine-assisted therapy and the work of facility dogs like Hoover, Jack, and Hal raises abundant questions about human and canine labor, and more specifically about the entry of animal workers into the fraud economy of U.S. health and human services. For instance, what does the influx of canine workers signal about the current gaps in U.S. human services? More particularly, should the entry of dogs into these fields be understood as commentary about humans' ability to care for one another and the qualities and organizations of that care? How do human service workers respond to their new canine coworkers? For instance, do they feel demoralized or buoyed when a dog takes up part of their professional charge? Much has been written about the alienating effects of automation on health and human services. Does it feel better to be replaced by a dog than to be replaced by a robot? Humans aside, how shall we address the question of dogs' labor, which is, after all, unpaid and arguably unfree? What are the ethical implications of putting dogs to work in settings where human service workers regularly experience secondary trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue? After all, unlike their human counterparts, dogs are not monetarily compensated, they can't unionize, and they can't effectively ask for personal time off. So these are some of the questions that have guided my research as I've followed dogs and handlers from their early training into their site-specific work. But this afternoon, I'd like to reflect on how canine-assisted therapy sheds light on another set of questions about language and culture. Specifically, I want to dwell on the conviction held by CAT, or canine-assisted therapy, proponents and participants, which is that dogs have an extraordinary, even magical capacity to read and speak to humans suffering precisely because they cannot speak at all. What are the historically and culturally situatable ideas about language understood as a system comprised of words and grammar that is spoken and heard or written and read, relative to a broader sign system that includes, for example, gaze, gesture, and haptic communication that allows for this kind of paradoxical formulation? I suspect that the rise and spread of canine-assisted therapy tells us something important about what culturally counts and is accordingly experienced as effectively affective communication, and about American English users' ambivalence about their own communicative capacities as human beings. So with that, let us return to the case of Hal, the 7-year-old golden retriever whose work I've been following for over 2 years. Recall that Hal is a full-time employee at a children's advocacy center, which is a multidisciplinary organization that handles allegations of child abuse. In the early 1980s, these centers were developed across the U.S. to house the myriad professionals that are called upon when there's an allegation of violence against a child. So this includes detectives, state's attorneys, medical examiners, forensic interviewers, social workers, child welfare workers, child life specialists, and psychotherapists. Hal has been on the crowded organizational chart of one of the largest children's advocacy centers in the U.S. since 2018, a relatively long stint in an agency with rampant staff turnover. He is arguably also the most popular staff member at the center, lauded among his professionally diverse coworkers for doing it all, from accompanying children through forensic interviews to comforting them through evidence-seeking medical exams to attending follow-up therapy sessions. As humans investigate, process, and triage allegations, Hal's job is to co-presence with traumatized children, using his uncanny senses to read what they need and respond accordingly. As one of his canine co-workers put it, Hal can give that emotional support that we want to, but we can't because of the size of their caseloads and the nature of their investigatory work. Yet it's not just these service workers' lack of time, but also the felt inadequacy of human communication that organizes interspecies communication in these ways that seem so innate and immediate. This includes his disciplined work in forensic interviews, whereas he has learned to silently nestle next to children for as long as it takes for them to complete a lengthy, structured, and highly sensitive series of questions designed to yield court-admissible evidence of abuse allegations. And this can take up to 3 or 4 hours. Several times a week, I watched as forensic interviewers led children of various ages to what is euphemistically referred to as the talking room, a 7x5 space with a one-way mirror behind which sits detectives, child protective service workers, and representatives from the state's attorney's office listening to and recording the interview. The interviewers would then come for Hal, attaching his blue vest and leading him into the talking room where, by way of a simple hand gesture or verbal command, Hal would jump up and situate himself beside child interviewees on the vinyl-covered love seat, barely big enough to accommodate a small human and a 75-pound dog. Now, for obvious reasons, my firsthand observations stopped there, but stories of Hal's forensic work frequently spilled into the daily talk at the center. For instance, most every staff member knows of a time when a clammed-up 7-year-old sat in teary silence, refusing to answer the experienced forensic interviewer's questions, however delicately posed. Stumped after almost an hour, the psychologist left the room to consult with her coworkers behind the mirror about how to proceed. As they began to strategize, the professionals watched with amazement as the girl lifted Hal's soft, floppy ear and whispered in a barely audible voice, caught on the video, "Do you think I should tell? Is it time to tell?" Gazing at Hal and twisting his orange locks gently between her fingers, she apparently discerned a response. And when the forensic interviewer returned, the girl disclosed a long and horrific account of abuse, stroking Hal's muzzle, which lay in her lap all the while. Though this happened months before my study began, the forensic interviewer, Monica, was in tears when she shared this story with me. Monica particularly values Hal's seeming ability to read children's trauma before they are spoken, working the critical and tension-filled moments of pre-disclosure. So she told me, "I've seen so many times where he sensed when a kid just needs that little extra attention. Hal has literally put his paw on their lap. It's just like he knows. But the timing is perfect, so perfect that I feel like he knows and he senses it." Yet Hal, in Monica's view, not only helps elicit court-admissible evidence, he responds to the child's words in a comforting way. This is particularly significant because Monica must table her own therapeutic responses, lest she be interpreted by the court as leading or otherwise prejudicial. Even then, Hal, like her coworker, Monica doubts that her own words could compete with the tonic of Hal's perfectly timed gestures. Center professionals who participate in medical exams are also awed by Hal's communicative prowess. According to one child life specialist named Leah, when Hal's custom-dog-sized gurney is wheeled up next to the child's examination bed, his presence switches the space completely. Leah further explained that while all the center's human workers have myriad demands and expectations of the child, which interestingly revolve around the production and processing of linguistic signs, Hal has no need for such media, engaged in the more important work of seemingly immediate co-presence. Voicing Hal, Leah reenacted a typical exchange in the medical exam. "I'm here, you're just going to pet me, and we're going to just stay here. There's no goals, there's no agenda. This is just you time. Leah added, and I think it's just having that presence that doesn't have that, have expectations. Now, there's no doubt that Hal provides critical comfort and care for many children during what they would experience as one of the most frightening and horrifying days of their lives. And some of these children return to the center for follow-up therapy where they continue to experience continued co-presence with Hal. Recounting a recent therapy session with me and a longtime client, one therapist underscored the immediate sense of connection that Hal provides haptically. Another therapist underscored the potency of Hal's gaze, which she interprets as the dog reading the child's energy. Needless to say, working with children who have been sexually or physically abused is challenging, upsetting, and often quite traumatizing for human professionals. The humans who stay at the center for more than a couple of years say that they have learned to turn off their feelings in order to stay in the work, which many view as a calling. Others simply move on to other kinds of service work after a year or two, citing compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. Therefore, I cannot help but be struck by the many times I've heard therapists telling me, as well as their clients, that Hal not only recognizes their trauma, but he can hold it, relieving children of some of their burden. If Hal indeed bears this weight, we should revisit the ethical questions of his 8-year contract at the center and the conditions of his labor, however valued he may be by his coworkers. And though he is quite beloved, I rarely hear such questions raised at the center itself. So when Leah tearfully recounted Hal's remarkable capacity to touch his wet nose to a child's face or hand during a painful moment in the exam, she quite optimistically imagines Hal saying at those very moments, "Oh, this is my moment. I'm supposed to be here for this." So arguably all therapeutic interventions downplay some signs and signals to the extent that they are experienced as troubling or counterproductive and offer up other signs and signals meant to soothe. In this sense, there's nothing unusual about canine-assisted therapy. However, this form of interspecies therapy reveals, I think, a profound cultural ambivalence about language relative to other forms of media. As some linguistic anthropologists have argued, in the United States, a distrust of language, particularly apparently stylized language, accompanies a lauding of language as the most sophisticated mode of communication. So on one hand, many adhere to the long-held belief that language is precisely what distinguishes humans from other animals and elevates us to masters of the kingdom. So one might think of Heidegger here and his contention that language is what allows the human to form, to open, and to be in the world, thereby escaping the boredom of animality. And notably, some anthropologists have social scientized this division, penning textbooks read by thousands of undergraduates yearly, whose very definition of culture rests upon distinguishing humans from other animals by way of our linguistic capacities. Of course, no academic discipline should be judged by its textbooks alone, and over the last decade or so, a growing number of anthropologists, some of whom are here, have examined human-animal relations without assuming a divide, linguistic or otherwise, in advance. Donna Haraway has led the way with her treatises on companion species, including her reflections on her own extraordinary relationships with her dogs. In addition to arguing that organisms co-evolve with each other, Haraway insists that we must strive to understand and represent these relationships from the animal's point of view. Now, some anthropologists who have pursued the project of animal perspectivism or perspectivalism, are not satisfied to simply decenter the human ways of seeing. They further insist that signification is not the exclusive province of humans. Animal, Cohn contends, along with his Amazonian informants, also have language, even if some humans tend to hear them only as barks, meows, or moos. So while some typically exclude animals from language and therefore from culture because they cannot grasp the arbitrariness of signs, purportedly, Cohn urges us to examine the ways that animals connect sign and matter, the worlds they forge through the iconic and indexical functions of language. However, in terms that should now seem familiar, Cohn goes so far to suggest that animals' language is more fundamental and even more efficacious than that of humans. And while one might quibble with Cohn's ontological twist on Peircean semiotics, given the ways that people live with, interact, and conceive of animals in the upper Ecuadorian Amazon, one might say that Cohn's conclusions about animal communication simply bear the marks of good ethnography. But what of the ethnographer who stumbles upon the very same kinds of formulations in a cultural system which generally cleaves humans from other animals and does so by way of language? For parallel to Cohn's theory of speech-free, symbolically cleansed representation, many North American canine-assisted therapy advocates most value dogs not for what they say or symbolize to human clients, but what they do not say and symbolize, as if the linguistic lacuna is exactly what makes dogs such affectively effective communicators. So here, in conclusion, it's important to note that while North Americans have long privileged the denotative capacities of language and have put these capacities to work in the talking cure, we also regularly worry that language is ill-equipped to wholesomely denote human experience, failing particularly when that experience is of human suffering or trauma. And if, as I suspect, the rise of canine-assisted therapy represents a shift in what it means to be an American human relative to what it means to be an American dog, it also bears directly on the question of how North Americans imagine, what they imagine language is good for relative to other forms of media. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be participating in this four-field symposium. So now I will offer the archaeological perspective, in particular from the Paleolithic period when we were not the only large brains hominids roaming the landscape. So today we're on the sole member of our genus. Our nearest relatives in the animal kingdom are other great apes, such as chimpanzees and gorillas. But we generally think of ourselves to be distinct, that we alone have culture, that we alone have technology, and although both of these suppositions have been proven to be false, nevertheless, it's nevertheless true that when we examine our lives and the role that culture plays, we easily see ourselves as something distinct, set apart from animals of the natural world. But there are many times in our past when we were not alone in this way of living in the world, that we coexisted with other species who also extensively used technologies and other types of cultural knowledge to survive and flourish. Our genus emerged from a period around 2 million years ago when there was a particularly high number of coexisting hominins. Our species, Homo sapiens, likewise coexisted with several other species and subspecies of the same genus, Homo. Neanderthals are the best known and most famous example, but others such as Denisovans, known mostly from DNA, also coexisted with humans as well, with Homo sapiens as well. And likely there are others that have yet to be defined. In the Pleistocene, populations were often fragmentary and isolated, and many subspecies of sapiens likely coexisted as well. So for example, in North Africa, where I work, hominid skulls have an archaic appearance and look quite distinct from sapiens in East Africa, even though most researchers place them in the same species. And all of these large-brained hominids were producing a robust record of material culture, implying that we are all dealing with the world in similar ways. So what was it like coexisting with others who may have been alike us in some ways, but very different from us in others? Today, our species has a remarkably small amount of genetic variability, but we have a long record of othering one another in our contemporary society and in history. So can these experiences give us an indication of how different species may have viewed one another in the Pleistocene, or do historical and cultural trajectories distort this view? Would it have mattered if two groups coexisted in the same region, the same territory over long periods, or if they only saw each other very occasionally? So archaeologists have long imagined what it would have been like to coexist when Neanderthals and modern humans encountered one another. One place where such a question loomed large was in France, where we have a particularly long history of research of on this time period. So archaeologists in France found first they excavated cave sites, and they found that the lower levels, these Mousterian deposits associated with Neanderthals, based on flake technology over the top of these layers stratigraphically. They found the origination based on blades. And in some sites, they found this other layer in between, a stone tool industry that was very similar to the origination in many ways, with blades, bladelets, worked bones, and beads, but also seemingly retained some characteristics of the Mousterian. So this industry is known as the Châtelperronian, a transitional industry, and others were found as well, such as the Uluzzian in Italy. But even more provocative was that two of the sites that contained the Châtelperronian industry, there were Neanderthals remains associated with this layer, leading many archaeologists to believe that this industry was created by Neanderthals. So everyone was wondering, does this imply cultural exchange, imitation, teaching? Or was it an independent cultural development by Neanderthals right before sapiens entered Eurasia? But these questions were overshadowed by serious doubts. Doubts about the stratigraphy, was there mixing? And doubts about the dating. This period dates to around 40,000 years ago, right near the extent of radiocarbon dating. So there was many large error bars in dates, there were infinite dates, a lot of problems in that regard. And for a very long time, we weren't even sure if Neanderthals and sapiens actually met, of course. So that created a lot of problems. But then, of course, in 2010, that question was finally resolved when we found through ancient DNA, the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, that actually Neanderthal DNA is present among many living humans. So this question that the two groups met is finally resolved. We know that they met in some capacity, but there's still questions about how it happened, how it played out, what was the timing of these encounters, and how it was that soon after Homo sapiens arrived in Eurasia, Neanderthals disappeared. And since this discovery in 2010, many other scientific methods have also been improved, and so we have, and so we're actually left with a lot more new surprises have come out, and we have a picture now that's actually potentially more complicated and more interesting than what we saw in the past. So one such interesting complication was found at Epidema Cave in Greece. 2 skulls were found at the site in the 1970s, but they were in breccia, suspended above the deposit, so they weren't associated with any cultural material. But more recently, a team led by Katerina Harvati recently revisited the crania, and she uses U-series dating, and these 2 crania, one which is a Neanderthal skull and one which is an archaic modern human skull. The Neanderthal skull was actually to be the younger of the 2, indicating that the Homo sapiens skull actually dated to over 200,000 years ago, indicating that there were incursions of sapiens into Eurasia when the Mousterian and the Neanderthal reign in Europe was in full swing. And there's also been upheavals in our understanding of the makers of these transitional industries. For example, the Illuzian industry found in Italy, which was long associated with Neanderthals, was actually found. It looks like now the makers are most likely to be modern humans, to be Homo sapiens. And likewise, similarly serious doubt has been cast upon the association between the Châtelperronian with Neanderthals. So a reassessment of one of the 2 sites found associated, Saint-Césaire, has found that there's no reliable association to support, or evidence to support the association between Neanderthals and the Châtelperronian. And even more new evidence has recently emerged from a site located in the Rhone Valley in eastern France. So this is the Grotte Mandarin, and it has a long sequence of Mousterian layers, but it also has wedged in between these Mousterian layers is another industry called the Neuronian, which is also one of these transitional industries based on blades. Later in the sequence, they also have a proto-Aurignacian layer that has been long associated with modern humans, but many people assumed for a long time that the Neuronian was made by Neanderthals. Perhaps it represented a group with some had some novel technologies that came in and occupied that site for a short period of time and then left. Here we have the Grotte Mandarin stratigraphy. You can see that those kind of light green, yellowish layers, those are these transitional industries. So layer E is the Neuronian, which you can see is a small layer wedged between the brown layers are the Mousterian, and then on top we have Neolithic capping the deposits. So recent excavations led by Ludovic Slimak have discovered a bunch of isolated teeth from the deposits. And most of these teeth were found to be Neanderthal teeth, but one of these teeth looks like it clusters among, morphologically among modern human teeth from the Pleistocene. So it looks like, we certainly need extra evidence to corroborate this, but for the time being, it looks like the Neuronian was likely made by Homo sapiens. And this layer actually dates to 54,000 years ago, which is quite a lot earlier than we thought Neanderthals were in this area, or modern humans were in this area. And then in addition, another member of Slimak's team, Sigloyen van de Velde, studied clasts of stone that had fallen from the ceiling of the rock shelter into the deposits of the cave. And when she looked at these clasts of stone, the underside, one side of these caves of the rocks was actually encrusted with calcium carbonate, but she could see layers of soot. And actually, when she looked at these layers of soot microscopically, they had these layers, some thick, some thin, that very much like tree rings, that shows these occupations of people building fires and leaving soot marks on the ceiling of the rock shelter. And so she was actually able to look at all these different clasts and kind of create kind of an estimate of the minimum number of occupations per layer. And in so doing, she was also able to see how much time had elapsed between occupations. And she noticed that between the Neanderthal layers and this Neuronian layer, so potentially made by sapiens, that very little time had elapsed, probably only a few seasons or a few years, which is a similar amount of time that she saw kind of elapsing between any other occupations. Interestingly, between the Neuronian and then the Mousterian layers, there was a big gap in time. So Neanderthals, after sapiens had left the site, there was a long time, perhaps even thousands of years, before Neanderthals kind of came back to this site. So to me, this could imply, I mean, this whole endeavor of kind of thinking about interactions between modern humans and Neanderthals is a bit speculative, but this could imply that Neanderthals were a bit more wary of sapiens than sapiens were of them. They kind of steered clear of this area for quite a long time. So anyway, it looks like we have a much more complicated picture of potential Neanderthal-sapien interactions based on all this new evidence. We're seeing multiple incursions of sapiens into Neanderthal territory quite early on. Based on his work at Groot Mandarin, Ludovic Slimak has proposed 3 waves of sapien expansion into Europe. To support these claims, he and his collaborator Laura Metz have looked at also stone tool assemblages from the site of Kaiser Akil in the Levant to try and looking at those layers, they've correlated these stone tool industries to look at, and they look like that matches up the layers, matches up with the technological waves. So he's this one early layer that's represented by the Neuronian, and then also the Venusian and Northern Europe, and then 2 other waves. Anyway, this model is almost certainly will be revised and modified over time, but I really like how it brings together much of this new evidence that's emerged in the last 15 or so years to give us a picture that actually seems a bit more messy and a bit more complicated, but much truer than this kind of like monolithic expansion of modern humans into Eurasia that was kind of the model that we've had for so long. And so, and now that we've kind of been freed with some of these problems of stratigraphy and problems of dating, we can actually try to envision the interactions between Neanderthals and sapiens, knowing that they did indeed meet, and then they had many opportunities to do so. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, because a lot of my research right now is thinking about living spaces, is the reoccupation of homes. So we can think about like the Neanderthals and the sapiens coming into these sites like the Groot Mandarin, where they're reoccupying the spaces that this other species occupied. So they're kind of in these spaces. We know for one thing, we know they both went to these physical spaces. So we know that this is one space, pinpoint on the landscape, where they actually both visited. And we can ask ourselves, like, okay, how was it that they, and then they encounter each other kind of through their material remains. And did they view these material remains, this way of occupying space, as foreign, or did they view that as something familiar? One of the things that I've noticed over my study of living spaces is that Homo sapiens sites actually usually have a much more organized way. They organize their space to a higher degree than I've seen in Neanderthal sites, showing that there is probably some norms of ways of behavior of organizing a living space. And so I don't see that in the case of the Neanderthal sites. So I'm just wondering about, when Homo sapiens came into Neanderthal sites, how they would have viewed these spaces. For example, the images I have here are from Arcy-sur-Cure, which is one of the 2 sites where we found Neanderthal remains. It's one of these well-known old Châteaubriand sites. And we actually found, the excavators here found that the Châteaubriand people had actually dug down into the Neanderthal layers. We can see over in the profile view, there's a layer there where they kind of dug down. There's a bunch of potential post holes that were dug into the layer. And so to me, that kind of shows maybe sort of irreverence, or I don't know, they don't seem to be holding these material, the home that they are inhabiting as sacred. They're kind of moving it and making it to their own devices, or kind of changing it and not viewing that thing as something that should not be disturbed at that space. And so, and that's kind of seems to be, you know, and then at the other hand, we look at the way that Neanderthals kind of stayed away from the Grotte Mandarin for a very, very long time. So it could be that they were just, Neanderthals were a bit more wary of sapiens than sapiens were of them. So what about hominin interactions in other regions, specifically hominin interactions of subpopulations of sapiens within the African continent? So for a long time, researchers had been trying to find an origin for Homo sapiens within the African continent, to pinpoint one place, potentially in East Africa or South Africa, where we can say our species came from. But now many researchers are coming together and they're saying, hey, wait, no, actually the evidence seems to suggest that this was actually a phenomenon that happened on the scale of the entire continent. That we're having gene flow, we're having ideas that the entire continent played a role in the emergence and evolution of our species. And for example, when we think about that phenomenon, we know that, okay, so probably people are encountering other people that looked a little bit, that had different ways of, it was much more regular perhaps to encounter other people who may have been a bit unlike you. So for example, prepared core technologies occur throughout Africa at roughly the same time, around 300,000 years ago. This implies that there was maybe some sort of exchange of ideas and technological know-how throughout the continent around that time. And then we do have, and that's quite different than what we see with these transitional industries in Europe, where it's a very sudden intrusion of a very, very different kind of technology, a very different kind of suite of material culture. We do see in Africa different kinds of points, for example, some things that different lithics that might be more influenced by cultural style. But the underlying chaîne opératoire of making flakes, for example, it remains, is very similar. And we also see personal ornaments and things like bone tools appearing at around the same time at many different places on the continent. So this implies a more regular cultural contact, and that likely the exchange of ideas and also genes was a more common occurrence than we see in Eurasia, where groups may have regarded themselves with more wariness. So our time resolution in the Pleistocene is so poor that it's really difficult to place two groups of hominins in the same place at the same time. But with new research, I think we're really getting better at able to envisioning these meetings and how they would have played out. So I have mentioned a couple of very small, tiny clues that may suggest that sapiens to have been less wary of Neanderthals than Neanderthals were of them. This might not necessarily imply that one group was more threatening than the other. It could be a product of their culture and past experiences. So we know that Neanderthals lived at low population densities and may have had much more loosely organized social networks than did sapiens. Neanderthals may have then been less accustomed to meeting strangers than sapiens. But these early incursions of Homo sapiens into Europe, they were probably also existing at very low population densities. However, they did, even in these early incursions, the material culture does contain personal ornaments, beads, which most researchers think of as a way of communicating group membership. So sapiens already had these kind of ways of these technologies to mediate interactions, and that was part of their cultural repertoire, something that Neanderthals didn't really, did not have as one of their main repertoires. So, but when they did see Neanderthals, they would have seen Neanderthals, Neanderthals would not have had the same deeds and things like that, so they would have been viewed as strangers. How early groups dealt with strangers with fear, friendliness, or hostility is an open question. If we look to our recent history, the picture is not rosy. But does our history mar this view? We have now been living in a world, especially in the Western world, where nature and culture has been presented as an opposing dualism for a long time. Since perhaps the Neolithic, we were separating the domestic things from wild things. And one primary view of debasing our fellow humans was to label them as part of nature rather than as part of culture. But did we even have that kind of dualism exist in the Pleistocene? This was a world, after all, where encountering humans of different species was possible. And now advances in dating and stratigraphy are finally giving us the resolution to actually look for hints of these encounters. And perhaps in another 10 or 15 years, the effort in imagining these encounters won't feel so speculative after all anymore. So thank you. I've included a lot of work from other people in this presentation. So there's
Okay, many thanks to both of our speakers for those presentations. That was an exciting and thought-provoking pair of papers, quite different, obviously, but united in sort of their exploration or sort of basal level considering of the things that make us human. And so we have about 15 minutes for questions. You may have noticed that there are microphones in each of the center aisles here. I will ask you to bring your question to the aisle. And the questions can be directed to either of the speakers, no order necessary. So as folks kind of organize their thoughts and make their way to those center aisles, I do have several questions. I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Clark yesterday and at dinner, so I will begin with you, Dr. Carr, if I may. So I was intrigued by this idea of dogs' labor as unpaid. It's not something I'd ever really considered. Service dogs, their labor is unpaid. And as an archaeologist, I sort of think about the origins of the human-canine relationship. And it's often described as a symbiosis. It's often described as kind of something that was mutually beneficial. And so I'm wondering if it's fair to say that there are mutually beneficial aspects to the human-canine relationships in the scenarios that you described, and how that might interact with your understanding of those relationships.
Is this working?
I believe it is. Yeah.
Okay. So wonderful question. And of course we know for thousands of years that dogs have been domesticated and therefore dependent on humans, and humans have depended on dogs for many kinds of labor, not just the kinds of labor I was discussing today. Ooh. Thank you, Bruce. You know, you can absolutely think about this in terms of the interdependence of dogs and humans. I do think, though, that, you know, if we think about contemporary American history, what we see, particularly in the realms where part-time therapy dogs are working 1 to 2 hours a week, what we're depending on dogs to do is often affective labor. So I think many of us who have dogs and who curl up with us when we're sick, or do things of this sort, give us gentle nudges and licks and so forth, do feel that kind of symbiotic relationship. I do think there are lots of questions, though, that are raised not just about the dog's labor, but also about human labor in these kinds of settings, where you have people who are often have graduate degrees and have put a lot of training into the kind of work they're doing, and they're incredibly poorly paid. They are working in very high stress, high burnout situations, and they do not have the kinds of resources to compensate their labor. I think in some ways the fact that the dogs are also unpaid, you know, not paid adequately, not cared for adequately, is something that we should attend to itself, but it also is a sign in some ways of the gaps of settings in which, you know, frankly, these are sites often of human catastrophe. I mean, a child advocacy center is a site of you know, calamity. And, you know, why is it that we are not treating either human or canine labor with, I think, the respect that it deserves?
Thank you. Thank think Liz. Oh, sorry, I didn't notice who arrived first.
Okay, thanks so much. I have a question for each of you. So, Amy, my question's really straightforward, clarifying. I thought you said the word industry. What did you mean by industry?
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's the word that archaeologists are always throwing around. It just means like the suite of tools and like the technological system, really.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And for Summerson, I have this question that's lingering with me. I'm totally all in the co-presence, non-verbal communication, but I'm really struck by how race and ethnicity can come to play in a human-dog relationship under these contexts of trauma. Because like for practicing Muslims, dogs are not seen as a companion. Like I have a friend, or Benedict Vosseron's book, where a dog signifies so much intergenerational violence, in histories of trauma in the United States. So I'm curious, like how you can breach that as a researcher in this ethnographic setting.
Yeah, so it's a really important question, and I will say that some of the dogs that I study are dogs that are sort of right on that cusp between dogs that work in judicial centers and detention centers, for example, providing therapeutic care, are working very, in tandem with police dogs and dogs that are doing detective work and so forth. There are some efforts for what is largely a very white middle-class endeavor, much like agility training. The world of canine-assisted therapy, particularly the part-time part of this, is a very, very white and very female world, actually. There are efforts, but they're not ones that you would that are particularly satisfying. So organizations, for example, the organization that Phyllis runs a program alongside the therapy dog training, which is a dog apprehension program, which is teaching kids and adults to, create positive reassociations with dogs, precisely because there is some recognition of the history of dogs being used, after all, to police slaves and to police brown and black people to this very day, right? So, so there are some efforts like that. But it is absolutely true that there are some, you can see patterns. For example, at the Child Advocacy Center is a good example. There is a very large Spanish-speaking population that comes into the center. There's a large Muslim population. And some of the kids are more apprehensive. And they have hired recently a bilingual dog handler to work on some of these kinds of issues. So what I'll say is that I don't think it goes unnoticed, but it is, like many other of these kinds of dynamics, there's lots of work to be done. So, yeah.
Thank you both for such engaging presentations. I have a question for each of you. So for Dr. Clark, I just was really struck by the images of what felt to me like almost like a timeshare. It was like of shared space. And I wondered, given that there's these two different stories being told about Eurasia and then Africa, and the distance and possible constant entanglement, well, in Africa and then in Eurasia, this more distance, if those same kinds of noticings have happened around time sharing of different groups in sites in Africa, or maybe that's not possible because you wouldn't see distinctions in that same way. Or I guess I just want to hear more about this sense of how close in time the timeshare was.
Yeah, I think this is just so difficult because we usually never have this resolution. So that's why this one site like Mandarin is so crazy, because we actually like have this really amazing, and then the work with the class and the soot is amazing. In terms of like other sites, I mean, in general, what we usually see are like sequences of different of like technological industries that might, you might have one layer with something that looks like one thing and then another layer, but it's hard to always, it's very rare that we have associations with hominins. We actually usually are just having to speculate who made these things. And so, yeah, I mean, usually we just see like, I mean, for example, in South Africa, we have these different industries like this Still Bay and Howieson Port, which are these different kinds of industries that are very, different and characteristic, but it's like, is it just different groups? Are they different, it's actually really hard to say because we really rarely have this kind of viewpoint. But thank you.
And then, Dr. Carr, that was such an incredibly, rich discussion. And I wondered, so it seems like one of the stories you're telling is about how there's a distrust of language and the dogs allow for that to be expressed. But I was wondering if alongside that, there might be a way that the specificity of these as professional settings feels like it's also a way that the dogs can do something that humans can't do. So there's a long history of professionalism and what we can and cannot do in professional situations, but that has a lot to do with bodies. And in the last decade or a little bit longer, it's less and less possible to touch in professional situations, even medical situations, and that's not the case around the world necessarily, even to this day, where physicians and medical folks can touch people's bodies. And it seems like besides we don't trust language, it's we are not allowed to touch, and dogs can. So there's all kinds of there's communication, there's touch, and there's speaking, but just the dogs can play a role that is not allowable in a professional situation.
Yeah, that's a super interesting point. Although I would say, I'd have to think through kind of each case, but I say right offhand, two of my sort of main dog interlocutors are in settings where there is actually, there has to be a lot of touch. So one is working in occupational and physical therapy, so the human professionals are engaged in a lot of touch. And certainly the kind of, we know all these interactions are multimodal, right? So, but unlike everyday talk, gaze, for example, is a kind of unbroken gaze between humans, and a therapeutic encounter is more acceptable than in other kinds of interactions. So I'd have to kind of think about that. I think and of course there's the medical exam, which is all about touch and, part of...
Except we do it a lot less than we used to. Physicians don't use touch as much as they used to.
I mean, in child abuse examinations,
that's what
it's a little bit different. But I take your point, which is an extremely good one, and I think that that's what's really interesting about watching these encounters is the way that certain kinds of, in these multimodal encounters, what kinds of signs are brought out as like meaningful and extraordinary, and what others are sort of, put aside or not noticed. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that there may be something there about it's not just a distrust of language, but sort of what we can and can't do as professionals certainly plays a role. Yeah. Thanks.
Am I next? Thank you so much for both of your talks. I've just got a question for Amy, if I can. Amy, you talked a lot about othering and relationships of difference with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. But of course, as you know very well, especially this is something that Steve Kuhn and Mary Steiner have talked a lot about. Neanderthals inhabited an enormous array of geographies, ecologies, east-west, but maybe more importantly, and this is very much the Kuhnian and Steiner sort of, one of their big points is their latitudinal scope was really quite large. And some of the most compelling evidence that we find for independent innovations of symbolic material culture come from the southern part of the range, and also where we do find evidence for structured residential sites, structured use of space. Again, coming from the southern parts of the range, sites in like Torfarage in Jordan, and then sites in Portugal and Spain and Italy in terms of material culture that we know was not potentially, or we suspect strongly was not influenced by Homo sapiens, right? Like the Shadow Peroni and so on. So I just wondered if you could speak to other interaction dynamics besides possible othering, given Neanderthals had, variable population densities and probably variable, selections in terms of signaling and so on.
Yeah. I mean, certainly like, the Neanderthals were, it was a very diverse population over a very big area. I mean, I guess I'm just, when I think about are you Brian, when you mentioned the southern part, are you thinking like, therefore, the southern part of the Neanderthal range would potentially come more in contact and would have had some cultural contact with modern humans?
I was thinking sort of independently, because they, those circum-Mediterranean areas, you could have larger population densities, less mobility potentially, because of just the plant food base, and so therefore sort of a different demographic situation that might have enabled a more sapien-like societies that may have actually influenced contact dynamics. I was wondering.
Right. Yeah. So within the Neanderthal population itself, certainly. I think it's just, I mean, there's a lot of variation, and they would have gotten, innovation certainly spread among the greater Neanderthal population. But I do think that there's something different in terms of like the speed of spread of innovations, like how connected these populations, and I don't think it's like a difference of kind, but difference of scale. So it just seems that that Homo sapiens just seem to like maybe be better at spreading of technologies. They may have had, like I mentioned, something. I mean, maybe better social networks in which these ideas could have spread. I would never say that Neanderthals didn't. I think certainly the spread of ideas did go among Neanderthals, and it's always hard to say whether it's just the fact that they were at very low population densities, sometimes fragmented population densities, especially with the swing of climate during the Pleistocene. Eurasia would have felt that pretty significantly. We always have that problem of, okay, was it just population density, or was it something about like cognition or sociality or these other things? But I think certainly Neanderthals had a certain amount of that, but something happened with Homo sapiens where they're really very good at spreading ideas.
I think we have time for just a single question.
I have a very, very quick and short question, and it's sort of an effort to bring these two subdisciplines together, because that's what this is all about, right? So how many archaeological finds did you have for dogs in the Neanderthal and that time? I mean, maybe there were wolves on one side and dogs on the other, but did you find any evidence of dogs?
I didn't find any evidence of dogs at Neanderthal sites, no. But that doesn't mean they're not there.
I bet they're there and you haven't noticed because you weren't looking.
I think there's lots of things that we're not seeing because we're not looking.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and let's please thank our speakers once again. We have now a break until 2:30. There are refreshments at the back of the room.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back for the second session of our symposium, and welcome again to those of you on the live stream. I'd like to introduce the moderator for our second panel session. Professor Elisa Paredes is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. She is a sociocultural anthropologist researching plantation agriculture, environmental activism, scientific conventions, and transnational trade between the Philippines and Japan. Her work appears in Ethnos, the Journal of Political Ecology, and Food, Culture, and Society, as well as in edited collections such as The Promise of Multi-Species Justice, published by Duke University Press in 2022, and Feral Atlas, The More Than Human Anthropocene, published by Stanford University Press in 2020. She is also co-editor of the volume Halo Halo Ecologies, The Emergent Environments Behind Filipino Food, forthcoming with the University of Hawaii Press. She holds a PhD with distinction from Yale University. And before joining us as an assistant professor, Dr. Paredes was an LSA postdoctoral collegiate fellow from 2020 to 2022 here at the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elisa Paredes.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you so much to everyone who is here. I hope you are all sharing in my excitement about this very special and very unique event. So it's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce our final two speakers for today, Professor Kevin Langergraber, a biological anthropologist from Arizona State University, and Professor Juno Salazar Pareñas, a sociocultural anthropologist from Cornell University. So as in the first session, I'm going to introduce them simultaneously. They will offer us a sort of glimpse of their research in 20 minutes each. After that, we'll open the floor to some questions, about 10 to 15 minutes as time allows. And then we'll sort of take another break and then move on to session number 3. So to begin with my introductions, Professor Kevin Langergraber is Associate Professor at the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. He has studied the behavioral and molecular ecology of the Ngogo group of chimpanzees in Kibale National Park, Uganda, since 2001, his first year of graduate school at none other than the University of Michigan. Go Blue. He has served as co-director of the Ngogo Chimpanzee Project, a long-term field project devoted to the research and conservation of Ngogo chimpanzees since 2011. His research combines long-term behavioral observations and demographic data with genetic data derived from non-invasively collected fecal samples to answer questions about the evolution of chimpanzees and humans. He held positions at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, and at Boston University before joining ASU in 2014. And he is going to offer us a talk entitled Kinship and Social Relations: How Do Humans Differ from Their Non-Human Primate Cousins? Finally, I'm also delighted to introduce you to Professor Juno Salazar Pareñas, who is Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies and Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Cornell University. Juno also serves as President-elect of the General Anthropology Division of the American Anthropological Association. As a feminist science studies scholar, she examines human-animal relationships, environmental issues, and efforts to institutionalize justice. She is the author of a multi-award-winning book called Decolonizing Extinction, the work of care in orangutan rehabilitation, published by Duke University Press in 2018, which traces the ways in which colonization, decolonization, and indigeneity shape relations that form more than human worlds at orangutan rehabilitation centers on Borneo. Her most recent article,
Ethnography After Anthropology, Become Moles, Not Mining Corporations, appears in the August 2023 issue of American Anthropologist. She held positions at The Ohio State University, Rutgers University, and Yale University before joining Cornell. And she's going to offer us a talk entitled Kinship with Non-Human Primates, but probably not in the way that you think. I'm so excited about the dynamism that I'm already starting to hear between these two talks. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Langer-Graber and Professor Pareñas.
All right. Thank you for inviting me back here. I haven't been back here since the day I defended my dissertation in 2007. Nice to see some familiar faces and meet some new friends as well. So, I don't know if this was a wise topic to cover in 20 minutes because it's a pretty big topic, but I'll do my best in convincing you that comparative primatology has something to teach us about kinship, not only in the non-human primates themselves, but in our own species. So humans are primates. Among the non-human primates, our closest living relatives are the bonobos and chimpanzees. I did some molecular genetic work a couple of years ago to probably push the date of the divergence between Pan and Homo back further than we used to think, probably as long ago as 7 to 8 million years. But this deep, long evolutionary history we share with non-human primates means that a lot of facets of human kinship have a deep evolutionary heritage. You know, from avoiding mating with close kin to living in kin groups in general to favoring kin and lots of other stuff. But non-human primates can also tell us a lot about the evolution, the origins of really the unique facets of kinship and social relationships in human. Like what is really unique and different. Human and non-human primates alike, individuals very common to live in groups with identified individuals. So they don't treat each other as like anonymous robots, but they distribute their affiliative behaviors, their cooperative behaviors, as well as their aggressive behaviors, not randomly, but with particular individuals over others. That is, they have these long-term, enduring social relationships. And a growing body of evidence in both human, shown here on the left, and non-human primate species shows that these social relationships, individuals have more social relationships or stronger social relationships. That is to say, individuals are more socially integrated into their group, have higher fitness. Here we're looking at longevity in humans, and these are similar data from female baboons. So just sort of talking about getting into things, how we really differ is that in non-human primates, the type of kin that are going to be available are going to be strongly constrained by the nature of the sex-biased dispersal system. So in most primates, like in most mammals, it's females who stay in the group in which they're born, whereas males go to a new group. So there's a lot of research in these female phylopatric species showing that strong relationships between females have positive effects on their reproduction. And importantly, these positive effects of social relationships on reproduction in these female phylopatric species occur independently of the positive effects that having a high dominance rank does on reproductive success. So however it is that social bonds are influencing reproductive success in these species, it's not only through the route of increasing their dominance rank, which it also does. So here's some recent ongoing work that I'm doing with my former PhD advisor here, John Mitani, still kicking around. So chimpanzees, are one of the few primate species, few mammalian species, where it's males rather than females who stay in the group in which they're born, whereas females move groups. So also one of the few species where males form really strong social relationships with one another instead of just fighting one another all the time. So in recent work, this is a 20-year data set of John following these chimps around, who's spending time together, who's in close spatial proximity, who's grooming. And a lot of time, of me staring at the butts of baby infants, waiting for them to give me a fecal sample so I can take it back to the lab and find out who the daddy is. We've come together with really a different story of how social bonds promote fitness in male chimps compared to what we were finding, other people were finding in these female phylopatric species. So if you just look at the effect of social bonds and paternity success here, and you're controlling rank differences among individuals, those individuals who are more socially integrated, this here indexed through close spatial proximity, actually are less likely to sire offspring. So you don't have effects of social bonds on reproductive success that are independent of dominance rank. So what social bonds do promote fitness, but they do it through increasing your dominance rank in the future, and then dominance rank itself is what gets you more likelihood of siring any kid. So social relationships are important in primates. They increase fitness. We're starting to learn a little bit about the mechanisms through which they influence fitness. So who do they form them with? And now we're getting to anthropology and kinship, right? The topic of today's seminar. So classical kin selection theory predicts that if you've got a fitness-enhancing social relationship, you should share it with individuals with whom you are likely to share genes. The easiest way to index that is through kinship, recent descent from a common ancestor. So maternal kin biases in behavior, nepotism through, with relatives who you're related to through the female line, are really widespread in non-human primate species as well as in humans. It's particularly well studied in these female phylopatric species I started our talk with. So mothers and daughters forming these really strong social relationships, maternal sisters who share the same mom, and so on and so on. And probably, the mechanism through which these female primates are recognizing their same-sex maternal kin works similarly as it does in humans. It's really mother-mediated familiarity. And I just want to, sort of emphasize here when I'm talking to an audience like this, when evolutionary biologists talk about kin recognition, we're not saying that the animals are directly assaying genetic relatedness per se, or that, like humans, they have a concept of kin or anything like that. We're just simply saying that they're acting on statistical regularities in the environment, statistical things that over evolutionary time have tended to be associated with genetic kinship. But this mother-mediated familiarity allows for the recognition in this sense of a great diversity of kin types in these female phylopatric species. So how this would work, mother and infants are close together from this mom-infant bond. That means then that the sisters end up spending a lot of time together as well. So on and so on. They all keep having kids, they all keep having kids. You get these extended kin networks of recognition, so things like maternal aunts, grandparents, and grand offspring. It's just sort of an extension of the mother-offspring bond, builds up these links of mother-mediated familiarity. So going back to male phylopatric species like chimps, where it's the males who stay in the natal group, they've got a much smaller set of potentially recognizable close maternal kin. So the males have got their maternal brothers. Now we're digging deep into the archive here for the first paper I ever published in my life, coming out of my dissertation. where we combined John's long-term behavioral observations of male-male chimp behavior, who's spending time together in party association, who's grooming, who's maintaining really close spatial proximity, who's helping each other in fights, these coalitions, who's sharing meat with each other, who's going on these territorial boundary patrols. And in the white bars here, those are the male-male maternal brothers. And in the darker gray bars there, those are the unrelated male-male dyads. And as you can see, for each of these behaviors, brothers are doing it, maternal brothers are doing all of these sort of assays, ways of assaying social relationships more than are the unrelated dyads. So they've got males in a male phylopatric society. Their same-sex maternal kin are their brothers. They've also got their mom there as an opposite-sex close kin. And in collaboration with a bonobo researcher, Martin Surbeck, and as well as chimp researchers from other study sites, we looked at the importance of these relationships for reproduction. So in both species, moms maintain sort of lifelong bonds with their sons, but they seem to be much more developed in bonobos than they are in chimpanzees. The mom-son relationship in bonobos is probably the most important relationship type in bonobo society. So these moms have a big influence on the reproductive success of their sons. So what we've just did here is, compared males who've got a mother living in their group with males whose mom had already died. And we look at, for any given paternity, how does mother presence or absence affect the likelihood that the son is the father of that kid. And you get a big effect in bonobos here with the black bars. And really, despite the fact that these relationships exist in chimps, they don't seem to positively influence reproduction, at least if you're measuring it in terms of who the daddies are. So this mother presence, this mother effect on paternity success in male bonobos might be responsible for another really surprising finding that we had a couple years ago, where we basically looked at, again, bonobos and multiple chimp groups in 7-year time periods and 12-year time periods where babies were born in these stretches. And we just looked at 2 measures of how uneven reproduction was among the males. The binomial skew index, 0 would mean all the males are perfectly sharing reproduction. There's no differences. Whereas 1 would mean it's like one male's making all the babies. Or you could look at another measure, the males, who's the most successful male, how successful is he? And we were really surprised to find that, and everyone was really surprised to find that male reproduction is actually much more skewed, much more uneven in chimpanzees than it is in bonobos. And one plausible candidate is that bonobo moms are really successful at increasing the mating success of their sons. We know this from behavioral observations as well. Okay. How do humans really differ in these really basic, from the perspective of just basic evolutionary biology? I think the biggest difference, again, at this very basic level, is that paternal kinship, that is relatedness through fathers, has a much stronger influence on social relationships and cooperation in humans than it does in any other non-human primate species. This is just the paternal brother version of that figure that I showed you earlier. And results like this are really typical. And that, if you squint, maybe you'll see that the bars for the paternal brothers are a bit higher than the ones for the unrelated dyads. But, in this result, it wasn't statistically significant. But this is just a really common finding that they sort of crop up here and there, but they're nowhere as strong as the biases that you're seeing between individuals who are related through moms. Another recent PhD, well, he's not so recent anymore, Aaron Sandell, but he found similar effects when we looked at the father-son relationships in male chimpanzees. So again, sort of just like this mixed bag of weak effects. Fathers and sons didn't spend more time together, didn't groom together. But if you control for the amount of association that they do, then their grooming is elevated. So some hints that something is there, but nothing really strong that you'd see. Probably in even like a human society that does the least amount of investment by fathers. Okay. Now I'm at the part of the talk where we're trying to sort of get us from a chimp-like common ancestor to what we've got going on in humans. And here I'm going to lean heavily. You probably should have invited this guy to give this talk, because this is really his ballpark, you know. So Bernard Chappé, he pointed out that, you know, if you look at human social and mating systems, there's a lot of amazing diversity and, you know, group formation, who mates with who, and things like that. But if you place this overwhelming diversity in the context of the diversity of non-human primates, it actually looks a lot smaller, and it's a lot more understandable. He argues that humans have this deep structure that is shared across human societies, and that's a combination of two features that are pretty common in non-human primates, but humans are, you know, unique in their combination of the two into one social and mating system. And lots of primates live in multi-male, multi-female groups. Lots of primates form pair bonds, but they're just like living alone, you know, isolated pair bonds. Humans are pretty weird in that we combine these two things, where most reproduction occurs between males and females who have some long-term social relationship. You know, that can be monogamous, polygynous, polyandrous, whatever, but it's some enduring bond in which a lot, if not, you know, not all, but a lot of reproduction occurs. So that obviously makes it a lot easier to recognize paternal kinship once you have pair bonds invented. Probably in a way similar to this mother-mediated familiarity. Like, who's your dad? Oh, who's your dad? Oh, that's that male who has this relationship with my mom. Who are your paternal brothers? Oh, those are those males who have this relationship with this male who hangs around my mom a lot, right? And then again, you can get these extensive patrilineal, the start of these extensive patrilineal kinship networks, where you map social value onto this what otherwise would be just this hidden patrilineal kinship structure. But Chappé goes one step further, you know, and this is where we're still at the stage of talking about biology, when we're trying to get from biology to culture in humans. So Chappé asks us to imagine the last common ancestor. He goes into reasons in this his book-like treatment that I can't do in this 20-minute talk, but imagine you've got a last common ancestor that's male phylopatry, female dispersal with promiscuous mating, like chimpanzees. And chimpanzee groups are closed, right? The males are very hostile to males from other chimpanzee groups. And when a female disperses from that group, she loses and joins this new group, let's say the one next door. She loses all contact, not only with her kin relations, but all the relationships she had growing up in this group. But imagine you add pair bonding to this system. And this male, you know, he goes to the edge of the territory. He sees his daughter in this other group. Now he can recognize her. Hey, that's because of pair bonding, right? He knows, you know, in the sense that I mean that's his daughter. He's got some, you know, inclusive fitness interest in her. His daughter has got a kid herself. Oh, he can recognize that's my grand offspring. I've got some inclusive fitness interest in that. But remember, pair bonding is also invented in this other group. So his daughter has got a husband, right? And he can recognize, hey, me and this, you know, my daughter's husband, my affine, have this shared genetic interest in our granddaughter. Even though we're not related, we can still. So the basic idea is that you combine pair bonds with these affinal relationships, and formal exchange of over time this group starts really reciprocal exogamy is basically what he's talking about here. You can get the pacification of chimp-like social groups. So why is that important? Because that, again, coming to some of the ways that humans really differ from primates, and Amy sort of started touching on this in her talk, is that we have these huge social networks, right? So Chappé is talking about a scenario where you get this multi-level social structure. Think, multiple bands who nevertheless share some larger social sort of affiliation, like multiple bands within an ethno-linguistic tribe, for example. And now my colleague at ASU has taken this even one step further. So you've got these much bigger social networks. Amy also briefly mentioned cumulative culture. And Kim Hill has made this argument that once you've got this multi-level social structure and high interaction rates among bands, that means that there should be stronger selection for sort of the really basic social learning abilities seen in other primates, because you've got way more useful models now, right? And he did some work to show that Ache and Hadza hunter-gatherer men during their lifetime are exposed to watch about 300 males make tools. That social network is so much bigger, so many more sort of useful sources of innovations than a hypothetical chimp with some cultural learning abilities would have. So therefore, there should be stronger selection for these abilities. So that's where now we're starting from. So the biological story of how kinship and biology starts to shift to culture, right? Sort of we can never really test all these things, but a plausible scenario of how you can get from these basic building blocks that we see in our non-human primate relatives to a cultural animal. And then they can do all sorts of crazy stuff with kinship, right? You know how kinship is so diverse, so divorced from biology in human societies and is modified in so many interesting ways. But this begs the question, Chappé just invented kinship in a chimp-like common ancestor, right? So I'm now just briefly going to go over some research that suggests that despite the promiscuity of chimps, males mating with multiple females, females mating with multiple males, that there might be some sort of building blocks for the subsequent evolution of full-blown, relatively, more exclusive pair bonds that we see in humans in our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. So in one paper, a couple years ago now, we looked at social relationships between adult males, adult females, when the females are not cycling, right? When they're just in lactational amenorrhea, taking care of their kids. So what we found was that these social relationships are really differentiated. There's some males who spend a lot of time, there's some male-female pairs who spend a lot of time together. There's some male-female pairs who almost never see each other. These relationships persist for many years. And the interesting part of it was that the probability of this male siring this female's offspring was better predicted by how much time he spent with her, when she's not even cycling, than was his dominance rank at the time that the conception occurred. So we've got cases of mid-ranking males siring 3 of 4 of a female's offspring that he spent a lot of time with over a 16-year period. Our most reproductively successful male at Ngogo is not the alpha male, but it's a mid-ranking male that spends a lot of time with particular females. So this was just the females weren't super well habituated when I conducted this study, so we were limited in the ways that we could really assay their social relationships. It was just how much time are they spending together in parties. But another graduate student of John's, this one really was a bit more recent. She looked at adolescent and young adult male chimpanzees and the relationships that they form with females. And she found that, like it was with party association, they were highly differentiated in, more finer grained measures like close spatial proximity and who's grooming whom. So, and males that formed affiliative bonds with these particular females had higher mating success with them. We haven't yet gotten a big enough sample of paternities to see whether that holds up in actual reproduction. But it's a mixture of affiliation and actually more aggression to the females that they form a particular bond with, that as the males get older, they do more of the nasty stuff and less of the nice stuff. But it got me thinking. We think of a lot of evolutionary, I don't know how whoops, good. But one way for evolution to change is the sort of mechanics of how it works is just neoteny, shifting the developmental timing. So maybe retention of these more younger male chimp behaviors of being a bit more nicer, and that's the route to reproduction, could have played a role in the selective process of going to full-blown pair bonding with parental investment that we see in humans, right? So the basic argument here is maybe the full-blown pair bonds we see in chimps that involve a lot of investment by fathers, maybe paternal investment, though that's an important function of it now. Maybe they just started as mating arrangements, right? Maybe they started as just as mating arrangements, and an extensive paternal investment came along later. Okay, finally, to close out here, I hope I've got enough time, because this is the exciting stuff that I really want to talk about. Another really, derived characteristic in humans is our extensive post-reproductive lifespans, right? Humans go through menopause, shared with really a tiny number of mammalian species. It's humans and toothed whales where females can expect to live for a long time after their reproductive period is over. And within anthropology, one type of kinship relationship has played a central role in explaining this derived characteristic of our life history. And that, of course, is the grandmother hypothesis, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. The basic idea being that the benefits of increasing offspring, especially daughter fertility or grand offspring, again, especially those produced through your daughters, grand offspring survival, are greater than the costs of ceasing reproduction. Now, there's a lot of evidence that grandmothers do have quite big fitness effects on daughter fertility, on grand offspring survival, and things like that. But it's unclear whether those benefits outweigh the cost of ceasing reproduction altogether, right? Because you're twice as related to any offspring that you produce yourself than you are any grand offspring. And when they actually try to measure the size of these benefits, it's hard to solve Hamilton's equation. Basically, it's unclear whether the grandmother effects are sufficiently large to explain reproductive cessation in humans. So I'm going to present you just some new work. I'm not allowed to say that's impress about, basically not only are grandmother effects maybe not necessary to explain the evolution of post-reproductive. So not only are grandmother effects not sufficiently large, some results in chimpanzees suggest grandmothering might not even be necessary to explain reproductive cessation in the few taxa that occurs. So basically what we did is we got 21 years of demographic data, patterns of mortality and fertility in Gogo females. And we calculated this statistic called PRR, post-reproductive representation. Basically, it's a statistic. It's a single number that you can calculate in different species that vary in their fertility and mortality schedules, vary in their longevity. You can make an apples-to-apples comparison. And it represents, having reached adulthood, what percentage of your adult life can the average female expect to live in a post-reproductive state. In humans, various human societies, it varies a bit, but it's around 40% of female adult years are spent as post-reproductive. In toothed whales, these few other mammalian species where you get a real substantial post-reproductive lifespan, it's a bit lower. In 50 other mammalian species, it's basically zero. And furthermore, you can do simulations to see whether the PRR is sufficiently large to reject the null hypothesis of simultaneous senescence, simultaneous ending of reproduction and the rest of the body. So basically, it's these few species, and the Ngogo chimpanzees, when we do the same calculations there with our data, are basically in the ballpark of the toothed whales, about half of what you're seeing in humans. Now, an additional sort of feature of this work that there was, even really new, is that we know the mechanism by which reproductive cessation occurs in chimps. We compared hormonal data. Menopause leaves this clear endocrinological signature. We get the same signatures. This comes from collecting a lot of chimp urine. And bringing it back to grandmothers, so they've got menopause, but they don't do any grandmothering behavior. Because of female dispersal, their daughters and moms live in different groups. Because of difficulties in paternal kin recognition, they're not really in a position to help their son's offspring, and various other factors. It just doesn't seem to be that grandmothering effects explain it. So anthropologists are going to have, I think, a lot of work to do to explain this really unusual phenomenon. So I will breeze through the rest of my slides and just thank all of our funding agencies. And of course, this is a multi-site, a multi-individual collaborative effort for all of this research.
Right. So thanks so much for hosting me at the storied anthropology department. So I should hopefully speak for 19 minutes, 40 seconds. However, I didn't time my breathing. So, right. At the turn of the 20th century, two white anthropologists visited recently pacified Iban people of Borneo. There, they commanded their Iban research assistant to shoot his own grandfather. His grandfather was in the physical form of what the anthropologists considered to be a gibbon. The subject of kinship, human and beyond, leads me to consider the different parts of the story, and in particular, the kinship of scholarship, specifically the genealogy of anthropology,
defined as it has been by its internal family feuds across its 4 fields of biological, sociocultural, arc, and linguistic anthropology. As much as we like to think of ourselves as unique and different from our siblings, we nevertheless have a common ancestry and a common inheritance, one rooted in violence and pain that many of us wish could be ignored or undone. And that is why I keep returning to the story of what Charles Hose and William McDougall paid their research assistant to do. For me to start a story about anthropology like this is perhaps an unfair provocation. These were awful colonial white men who enthusiastically supported white supremacy. Charles Hose was a colonial officer and a self-identified jungle walla, a term that boasted of his becoming native in the tropics. He worked under the second white Raja, Charles Brooke, whose reign was focused on expanding Sarawak's territory by either crushing or co-opting Dayak, Malay, and Chinese opposition and exploiting global timber, pepper, and oil for personal enrichment. Hose's co-author and companion on his field research trip was William McDougall, who was a young student in his 20s at Cambridge University and was new at conducting field research. He went on to found Duke University's psychology department, and in his position of authority, he publicly shared his racist sentiments about Black intellectuals of the day. When McDougall was a young man, his advisor at the University of Cambridge was W.H.R. Rivers, who went on to advise Radcliffe Brown, who in turn advised Evans Pritchard, who looms exceedingly large in my own intellectual genealogy and scholarly training. In short, this horrible man who tried to pay his research assistant into killing the worldly form of his grandfather is my distant uncle. Even without the help of a kinship chart, anthropologists can trace a connection to these men. In 1901, when their paper was published based on field research that took place in 1898, they probably did not identify as anthropologists, nor did they identify likely as psychologists or as social scientists. They were proto-anthropologists. They were going somewhere, talking to people in order to figure out social relations in an expansive way that included non-human others. They were doing field work, the kind that I do, the kind I train students to do. This premise alone means that even without the pedigree of a genealogical intellectual tradition, these awful white men are indeed my ancestors in the way they are ancestors for anyone who thinks they gain knowledge through field work with human research subjects. Knowing this compels me to consider the question of what do you do with the relics of an ancestor, who is no longer acknowledged as an ancestor. So I say the pronoun you, but you and I know it's an inclusive we. Even though I'm not technically in an anthropology department, let alone a 4 fields department, it's a problem that I inherit by the fact of having been trained in anthropology in a 4 fields anthropology department, and because of a personal commitment I have to ways of knowing that are uniquely generated by cross-disciplinary conversation. So why am I invested still in 4 fields anthropology? It might be because my tastes run a little gothic. I found myself in love with 4 fields after it was pronounced dead by Dan Siegel and Sylvia Nagasako. My intro to primatology class in my 2nd year, along with an internship at Oakland Zoo in my 3rd summer of my PhD program, inspired me to adopt behavioral sampling methods in which I focused on an individual or a pair and wrote down their observable behaviors in 1 to 5 minute intervals. This method enabled me to theorize affect as a form of nonverbal sensation experienced between bodies, one that had the power to motor a global economy of voluntourism. Likewise, a language and culture course that I took and then later TA'd compelled me to think of pronouns as shifters, which had been generative for me in thinking of social relations and ideas of a common we living under apocalyptic fears. The case I want to share with you today is a matter of a different kind of concern, but one that highlights what genuinely cross-disciplinary perspectives can yield when facing the problem of knowledge obtained through dubious circumstances. So I want to share the highlights, a case that highlights this problem, namely the case of Anthrocast, which was a project funded by the Venner Grand Foundation from the 1960s to the 1970s. And it's currently housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And I'll end my time by returning to how do we relate to the findings of Hose and McDougall, the two proto-anthropologists with whom I started this talk. UPenn discovered that it held the remains of a child victim of Philadelphia Police Department's deadly firebombing of the shared home of the Black Liberation Organization MOVE. These bones were used by physical anthropologists Alan Mann and Janet Monge as teaching materials at UPenn and Princeton up until as far as 2019. In a push to absolve themselves of their connection to Janet Monge and Alan Mann, the museum contacted the owners of property associated with Monge and Mann that were housed at the museum. One property owner was Wenner Gren, and that property was Anthrocast. The idea of Anthrocast was to make high-quality reproductions of bones and fossils for education and research. From originals, technicians would make a cast, which would then be used to make a pattern from which you could then make a mold. However, the program was never profitable, and Venner Gren ended the program by 1976. To deal with this ethical conundrum as it erupted in 2022, Wenner Gren invited a group of anthropologists last month to think about this problem that none of us in the room created, but one that we all inherited. So we were organized into 3 groups and given access to archival documents concerning 3 representations from the collection. My group was tasked with materials associated with non-human primate others, and we each wrote single-author essays leading up to the meeting. What I brought to the room was a series of questions. What do patterns, molds, and material effects of Anthrocast represent? What possible value could there be in maintaining what might be dismissed as antiquated or even obsolete ways of understanding human evolution, especially when their existence in a collection was the result of deadly colonial violence? What obligation do we have to the petrochemical pattern made of an unknown gorilla whose story of how it ended up in the possession of an institution in Zurich remains mysterious but plausibly guessed? Historians of science would say the collection says more about the collectors than the collected. Without a doubt, the value originally attached to the casting project of non-human primates was to their perceived connection to a story of human evolution. The story has long been rightfully criticized for its racism, sexism, and bias. The value I vest in these samples is not in their connection to human evolution and in their telling a story of human evolutionary achievement. Instead, I value the interpretive act of how people place themselves in relation to these objects. When looking specifically at the documentation involving non-human primates and Anthrocast, we must consider the moral weight of extinction. 2 of these creatures in question are long extinct, and one continues to exist but is critically endangered with decreasing populations. Thus, the collection is not just about the collectors, but about the materialized traces of lives once lived. Such traces require us to fathom the meaning of millions of years, how death on a mass scale and specifically extinction events demarcate time periods of the planet, how anthropogenic actions of the present and recent past threaten to annihilate other species on this planet in the near future. The objects described and discussed in these documents convey how they are both the work of collectors and shadows of the collected. I think we can learn 2 themes from the collected non-human primate and extant species in Anthrocast. And extant because they're not actually all primates, some are tree shrews. First is the problem of perfection posed by the preservation of patterns and molds. And second, the problematic way of knowing human evolution and human relations on an epic scale that is represented by Anthrocast. The story of the gorilla might begin in 1968 in a place identified in documents as Spanish Guinea. Equatorial Guinea came into existence as a post-colonial nation in the same year written on the document, Spanish/Equatorial Guinea was shaped by 20th century plantation industries of cacao and coffee that exploited coerced workers from throughout West Africa. Its cacao and coffee plantations were fueled by outside capital, while scholars point to actions taken there by British, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and black capitalists. Rarely do accusations fly towards Zurich and famously neutral Switzerland. Yet, as the exhibit Blinde Flächen, Zurich and der Kolonialismus, Blind Spot, Zurich and Colonialism, recently argued, Zurich as a source of capital was deeply implicated in colonial exploitation. We cannot know from this document whether this gorilla was shot, killed, eviscerated, dissected, and its bones made into a mold in 1968 or earlier. However, we are left with a suggested connection between Zurich and the violence of deforestation and the imposition of plantation industries in an ecology that once hosted gorillas. The actors whose documents we are reading from 1971 seem to not be interested in the specific details of the provenance of the gorilla. Spanish Guinea in 1968 is all that marks anything of a deeper story. For these document writers, the focus is on the accurate replicability of the mold, the rips and tears that happen when trying to remove the mold from the cast, the missing keeper shell for the mold. The matter of the mold, with its size difference between the cast and the mold when measuring molars, silently points to how an individual comes to represent an entire species. The mold is taken from a specific individual and made generic. That pursuit of the generic is an impossible pursuit for perfection. They want fidelity to an original that can be reproduced. However, that original is never able to be perfect because they are one example of a singular member of a species with variation within the species, and because the attempted duplication of casting a mold leads to size differences between the mold and the cast. Instead of perfection, what is achieved is an abstraction that both erases individual life history and values the gorilla's death and objectification over the gorilla's life and agency. The detailed process mold maker manual of instruction highlights a remarkable distinction from how such fossils are often treated now. The guide details how the original fossil should be cleaned before being molded. Removing grease or foreign material ensured a perfect mold and that then a pattern could be made. This is different from how ancient DNA is currently extracted, where foreign material yields information such as what that living being once ate, where they traveled once the food came. What if we considered the mold or pattern to be not of a generic gorilla, but instead a very specific gorilla? Would it allow us to see processes of wiping clean a fossil for the purpose of mold making as a process of erasing individual life history? Would it get researchers and students to fathom its afterlife as a collected object? Would it enable us to see the binds of colonialism that tie Zurich to Equatorial Guinea? Would it allow us to remember an individual who once had a life that was abruptly and likely unjustly ended? So, what does beholding an object made of plastic, silicone, and gypsum in modern manufacturing techniques do for the beholder if the object is supposed to represent a distantly connected ancestor or relation? This makes me question what exactly is the kind of ancestor represented in Anthrocast. This is where Charles Hose and William McDougall come back into the picture. In pushing their research assistant to kill their grandfather, the two were purposely testing the meaning of the Iban concept of nyarong, or worldly familiar of deceased kin. Nyarong take the form of gibbon, orangutan, and others that are broadly identifiable as Bornean wildlife. In their article, Hose and McDougall report that the research assistant said the following when prompted to shoot his grandfather. Quote, I don't want to, this is them writing, I don't want to kill you, but the Tuan who is giving me my wages expects me to, and the blame is his. But if you really are the Nyarong of my grandfather, make this shot miss you. He then shot and missed 3 times, and on the 4th time he killed the gibbon, but not the one he had spoken to. Angus, which I highly doubt is his name, I suspect it's a Scotification of typical Iban name, which is Angon. He does not think the gibbon helps either his father or himself, end quote. We are not privy to the actions and events that prompted the Iban man to express rejection of Nyarong within this paragraph. Yet we are left with the possibility that the surviving gibbon is a surviving Nyarong of his grandfather. By reading Hose and McDougall more than a century later, you get the impression that people have ancestral ties with what are considered animals or plants by some. Such ancestral ties are not necessarily in an evolutionary model of descendants that is common in the West. We can also consider birthing trees in Australia, where environmental and human DNA have been co-present in soil for millennia. These trees are ancestral to specific clans for specific people, and not in an abstract way, nor in an evolutionary way. Orangutans and trees might be ancestors, whether in the present or in the relatively near past. Yet this should not be used as a broad claim that all material related to non-human primates and other extant species are necessarily sacred. Some Ibans who have converted to Christianity, for example, reject orangutans as ancestors. The process of killing and taking specific individuals out of their ecologies severely transforms their meaning and relation, such that an individual who might have been a Nyarong for a loved one no longer is treated as one in its present form. What do you do with ancestors that are not claimed, for whom ties have not existed for centuries or millennia or millions of years? So this is the problem posed by the molds and patterns that are identified as Ramapithecus and Zinjanthropus boisei, which at this point I know are two obsolete terms. So this question is different if we think of unearthed skulls associated with these species as property. They are obviously claimed and owned as property by the government of Tanzania. But my question is not about property, but about ancestry. Zinj existed about 1.8 million years ago. Ramapithecus, 14 million years ago. This is likely difficult to fathom for those whose lifetimes are measured in decades. The existence of these bones and molds of these bones compel a reckoning of deep time. How is it that humans who have existed for such a short blip on the timeline of Earth created so much havoc for those whose ancestors have existed for millions of years? This is a question that is not just for those who were victimized and harmed by the killing of specific animals, but a question for every person living on the planet at a time in which extinction threatens many other life forms. So I jumped to the conclusion that the gorilla pattern conveys a story of ecological and colonial exploitation that once yielded a deadly encounter between a human shooter and a gorilla. Likewise, I surmise that Anthrocast is a story of plastics, like epoxy, invading every facet of human life in the 20th century. I also assume that there are other forms of kinship tied to original bones, and the patterns made from them that are not about a generic story of human evolution, but about meaningful ties specific to the life forms once attached to them. I suspect that some of these ancestral ties may lately be rejected or neglected. I also assume that it is possible to read between the lines at the hidden transcripts of what might have surpassed between Hose, McDougall, and the research assistant. The casts that can be made from these patterns materialize anatomical representation and originate from the violence of colonialism and its devastating impact on formerly colonized peoples, their ecologies, and their societies. This colonial past cannot be erased. It cannot be sanitized. It cannot be repaired with a single payment or transaction or act. Thus, it is important to face and understand how colonialism, white supremacy, and other forms of injustice have shaped the creation of this collection and the creation of anthropological knowledge. Using provenance documents to create what Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation, or a process of speculation based on archival research that goes beyond the limits of archival bias, can help restore individuality and erase or not erase, and alleviate the violence of abstraction. Such narration can be a powerful tool for helping researchers and students face the past and think about the ways their sciences connect to legacies of violence and destruction. In the hands of different kinds of researchers and students who are posing different kinds of questions and for different ends, I hold on to the hope that these objects of analysis, whether we are talking about copies of fossils or written texts of colonial anthropology, have the power to reject their racist, sexist, and imperialist histories. These objects associated with their rejected disciplinary ancestors, such as people like Louis Leakey, Alan Mann, or William McDougall, yield different answers when posed different kinds of questions. Thanks.
Gosh, I'm so wowed by both of those papers. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Now I'd like to take this opportunity to open up the floor to anyone who might have questions for either or both of our speakers here. And I'd like to welcome in particular those who have questions that bring these two papers into conversation.
Thank you for those great talks. It was really interesting, and I love seeing the four fields brought together through the intersection of animals and humans. I have a question for Kevin. So kin selection is this idea that we, when we help those with our genes, those genes are promoted to the next generation. That's all throughout behavioral ecology as helping individuals. We also know, especially in primates, that social bonds also are promote, and animals that have closer social, at least primates that have closer social bonds, tend to do better than primates that are more isolated. So my question is, we often see that these go together. The social bonds are the kin. My question is, how much, maybe this is a little too weeds too, but how much do you think that's kin selection? And you can talk about chimps or you can talk about all of primates, but my question basically is, how much of it is that it's the social relationship that matters, and whether they're kin or not, kin is like the easiest available individuals that they have, and how much do you think it might be kin selection?
All right, great question, and I will duck it by just saying that the answer to that question will vary tremendously from social system to social system. But you're right that that primates get a lot of direct fitness benefits, promoting their own reproduction by forming social bonds, and we know that because they often form them with non-relatives, right? There's a lot of individual variation. There's a lot of species to species variation, and probably in chimps, compared to these classical sort of female philopatric species, you get a lot more formation of strong social bonds among non-kin, just because the kin networks are, even if you're just talking about maternal kin, the kin networks are a lot smaller. So yeah, I actually wrote a paper, that sort of, when I wrote a review paper, where I sort of actually suggested what's at the heart of your question, that probably the kin selective benefits of social bond formation, even when they're forming between kin, have been probably overestimated in primate species. You can read about that in the Evolution of Primate Societies, if you are so interested.
Thanks so much for that response. Anyone else that I can welcome to the floor?
Hi, this is a very basic question that stems from ignorance for Kevin. You talked a lot about different sorts of mammals, even beyond the primates, when you talked about whale species and so forth. And what I was wondering about is, what about some non-primate species that also have, I gather, long-term pair bonding and perhaps other kinds of quasi-social relationships, like among some species of birds, where you have flocking and you have, I believe, pair bonds that can last for some time. And I wondered whether there was a similar kind of research that could be done or has been done there, and what the implications of it might be.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will do my best to answer it as a non-ornithologist. So I guess my understanding of that, so that sort of unique combination that humans have of multi-male, multi-female groups and pair bonding, I don't know if you could say that the sort of like birds have, a lot of bird species have pair bonds, but they don't have that sort of closed male-female, those closed social groups that we're talking about in non-human primates. So I think I would say that that's probably a big difference, and maybe sort of makes primates sort of, not only for their phylogenetic proximity, but as good analogs of talking about how we came to this unique combination in humans.
Sorry. I have a question for Dr. Perennius. So I work as a docent at our Natural History Museum here, and so I interact a lot with like school children and lay groups of people. And I find myself thinking about because I think about those connections a lot, but I find myself often thinking, what are ways that I could encourage people who aren't even necessarily in sciences at all to sort of think about these relationships when they're exploring something with the museum, or when I'm trying to teach something to the public. And I just wondered if you had any perspective on that might be interesting.
Yeah, last year I was in conversation with the Tropical Museum of the Netherlands to brainstorm how do you teach climate change to little kids, and we came up with things like, get your emergency kit together, run away from your tsunami. But it was also, that particular museum also had an exhibit on slavery that was geared towards 7 to 12-year-olds. That there are many other museums who are feeling the moral obligation and duty to educate children of the kind of legacies we're steeped in. And I think it's really good to talk with collaborators and other partner museums to figure out how do you do that education, while also, I know, being subjected to the fire of politics of local states, especially in the U.S.
I'm trying to turn my thoughts into a question, and I hope you'll forgive me that they really are more thoughts that I hope that I'll get a chance to talk with both of you about more as the day and the evening go on. So I'll give it a shot, though, now. So I was really taken with this idea, Kevin, of kinship as statistical regularity of behaviors. And I did have, just out of my naivete towards the kind of work you do, a question about, how do dominance relations or violence or something of that sort, how does that fit into sort of the notion of behavioral association? How do you separate that out from other kinds of associations? And with Juno's talk, that came into an entirely different kind of light, right? Is that how do we think about dominance and violence in relationship to association, regular association, made me think that this is both an empirical question that you all demonstrated in very different ways, and obviously an ethical one. So I hope that we'll be able to continue to talk about that and that you'll be able to make that into a question since it wasn't really one. But I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I'm going to let you go first.
Okay. You know, it was like a month ago in this workshop setting. I really had a great time talking to paleontologists, and the thing that I kept laughing about in our conversations over this super serious thing is that the gorilla is subjected to human violence, whereas like these ancient fossils, it's non-human violence, you know. And then we kept joking like, oh, the lion probably killed these people, you know, killed these ancestors, you know. And so then it really felt that by splitting us into 3 groups, like the non-human primate group had like a way easier time just like coming up with, okay, here's our solutions, this is our plans of actions. And where I think the ancient, the people who were working with bones that could be traced to living ancestors had the hardest task ahead of them. And it's such a difficult conundrum. And yeah, they enter it with a lot of wisdom. It was Rachel Watkins, who was part of that group. Someone from the Smithsonian, I forget her name, but yeah, it's like people who are well equipped for thinking about it, but it's not that they're going in as expertise, that they have to really cultivate a kind of humility when dealing with so much histories of ongoing violence, that I think the best thing is to be in a position of listening. But you know, with the non-human primates, it's a different kind of listening. You know? Yeah.
This is a hard question for me to answer, but you know, I guess I would just start riffing about how I think we can look at our primate heritage, and you know, I know we're not supposed to look for lessons in the natural world about how we can behave, you know, about what the morally correct way to live is. You know, that would be committing the naturalistic fallacy. Yet, nevertheless, I think it's just sort of a beautiful part of our primate heritage that, you know, like we're here with characteristics that have survived this process of competition, you know. And people think of competition, you know, you think of alternative characters, and those that leave the most descendants are those that come to predominate in the population. And you know, natural selection you think of that competition, you sort of what comes to mind naturally, survival of the fittest, violent competition, but literally what this type of research is showing us is that some form of this competition is who's best at forming these nice relationships with one another. And literally, you know, we've got a long primate heritage, at least part of it is that doing these nice things for other people in our groups to promote their fitness, because it promotes our own fitness, is at least part of the heritage that all of us, all humans across the world, carry with us.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions from Orvin and from Stacey.
Hi, this is I have to admit I'm from more of a social cultural perspective, so please forgive my ignorance. I have a clarifying question for Dr. Langer-Graber. One for both of you. So the first one is I'm thinking about what you said about like how there was you described the kind of development of pair bonding among chimps as kind of like traces of it or kind of glimpses of it.
Yeah.
I started thinking about that as a, you know, maybe this is like a word choice thing, but it kind of made me think a little bit of like evolution and selection and similar to the previous questions, but I'm kind of I'd like to ask a little bit more about you know, what is kind of selecting those traits, and if it's possible to look at it from like a historical perspective, like are there ecological changes that we can kind of contribute to this, or is this kind of development of pair bonding kind of just like what is making, basically what I'm asking is what is making the chimps adapt to the environment in a way that's like, in a way that's developing these pair bonding kinship formations.
Yeah, so, it was a short talk, so I didn't have time to go into the subtleties. But one thing I'd sort of like to emphasize that I didn't have time to say is that these sort of, what I'm calling like watered down versions of pair bonds, which may be sort of the starting point, the building blocks for subsequent evolution of full-blown pair bonds in humans, they do seem to be specific to the Ngogo community of chimpanzees. And there is, sort of just a classic old theory in behavioral ecology, and that is that the spatial distribution of females, like how spread out they are, that sort of determines what male reproductive tactics are actually going to work. So in the group that I study, Ngogo, is an unusually large chimp community. And we know that the effect of dominance rank on reproductive success is smaller at Ngogo than it is in other chimp groups. And that's probably because, just dominance doesn't pay off so well when females are so spread out and there's so many of them. So, some males can sort of take this alternative strategy of not playing the dominance game, instead cozying up with particular females. So, you could sort of, tie it back, and maybe it was this human group size getting bigger in human evolution that reinforced that sort of selective process.
All right, is it okay if and yeah, another thing was, I really thought it was a little beautiful, honestly, that the pair of talks one was about kind of how kin is accumulated or gained, and another one is how kin is rejected or kind of deleted. I don't know why I'm like thinking of like the French word like jeter, like I don't know. Maybe that's how I imagine like canceling people. It's like you defenestrate them out of the building, maybe this building, but it's like, yeah, in the sense of this. I guess this is for both of you, but slightly more towards Dr. Perrins, because this is a kind of a historical question, in the sense of like how kind of we can use these studies together to kind of, I don't know, to reimagine the role of like scientific classification in examining, like reckoning, like with the role of science in the way that we kind of imagine kinship today. This is a kind of a big question, so I'm sorry if, like, yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I feel like part of my argument is that we want to reject them, but we can't.
Mm-hmm.
They haunt us, and that we have to then deal with them. That we really would love to just close the closet door, but
you can't throw them out the window.
Yeah, you can't throw them out the window. And so it's more about, okay, how do we face this? But I do think that when you're reading colonial texts, it's like you have to really be aggressive in not getting captured by the logics of the colonial text. And so you have to be really diligent, and then like remember that, okay, whatever they say, pair it with other documents that show how horrible, to give you like the political, economic context of what these people were saying, to balance. I don't know if you could really have a proper balance, but to avoid capture from these ghosts.
I don't know if what I'm going to say now is going to be directly related to what you talk about, but your talk was interesting to me because, we're actively involved in, hopefully not all these horrible things that these colonial people were doing, but, we have a lot of chimps that die at our study site, and, we try to treat it with a certain amount of reverence, because we want to get as much information as we can out of these animals. So after if we find a dead chimp, we bury it and exhume it after a year, and Laura does it, and thanks, Laura. But it is it's like Laura and I were together 2 summers ago when our alpha male Jackson died. Have any of you guys seen Chimp Empire?
Don't spoil it.
So I'm going to spoil it because you should have seen it already. Episode 4, the alpha male Jackson dies. It was a very sad time. This is a chimp we know that I knew for 20 years. we saw him get attacked. We followed him for 3 days. I filmed that. Me and my graduate student Kevin Lee filmed that death scene of Jackson. Then the next, then we had to, do some stuff to his body to prepare him, and that was just a very reverential process. That actually took account, sort of some of the local norms of the Ugandan colleagues that we work with. So we just try to do this as respectfully, not only of the chimps, but of what the local people too, our field assistants who have worked with these chimps for so many years, how they deal with these things.
Thank you.
That's about all the time that we have for now. Thank you all so much for this exciting conversation. We'll take a break, and Julie will tell us how long we have, and then we'll gather back together for our final, our final panel session. Thank you.
Long-standing collaborations with colleagues from public health, biological anthropology, engineering, environmental science, political science, and economics. Dr. Roberts and her collaborators investigate the embodiment of inequality through a longitudinal chemical exposure study in Mexico City that has followed women and children from working-class neighborhoods since 1994. Currently, she and her collaborators are working with the Mexican National Health Census to better understand the impact of water intermittency on chronic health conditions. Her research is widely disseminated in top journals, and she has a new book entitled In Praise of Addiction in press now with Princeton University Press. That is the focus of our current Roy Rappaport lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Liz Roberts and the return of our 4 speakers.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you 4 wonderful speakers for coming and joining us and taking up the prompt, Kinship, Humans, and Beyond. And we didn't have a real set thing in advance to do here. I wanted to see what happened in terms of the talk and then the possible kinds of discussion. So I'm hoping what's going to happen is I have a question or two I could launch off with, and then hopefully you'll just have fiery, dynamic conversations in between yourselves, and then when it feels right, people will also get up and ask questions at the microphone there. But I also think in the 1 or 2 questions I have, when it becomes your turn, and if there's something that you're dying to say in response to another speaker that doesn't have anything to do with what was asked of you, just say it, and hopefully we'll have this conversation. So I guess I have bad things just happen, but I don't think anything needs to happen. I'll just stick that there. And you'll look at that. So I think I could start with 2 questions and you could answer either or both or just connect. So the first question is, one of those simple questions that's super broad and you can do anything with it, which is, what is kinship? And, go to town. But the other question is more, I think, coming from what we're trying to do here. I came from UC Berkeley. It was a joint program with UC San Francisco and Berkeley, but I was also an undergraduate there, and this was the 90s, and I was formed as an anthropologist by a class. We had to take, current issues or old anthropology and current issues in anthropology. And the year I took it, I was a junior in college, was taught by Vincent Serich and Nancy Shepherd-Hughes. And that might mean something to some of you here. So Vincent Serich was a biological anthropologist who became incredibly controversial for the things that he said about race and head size. And then Nancy Shepherd-Hughes was a medical anthropologist, and it was a very dynamic class because they fought the entire semester, and it gave us the capacity to see people fighting with each other and the capacity to kind of form ourselves around arguments and ideas. And for me, that was a really powerful way to think about doing anthropology, not necessarily that way, but to kind of bring different subfields together to have those conversations. But something that feels like it's changed since then is that was the 90s, and we were really locked in this nature-culture debate that feels kind of spent in many ways at this point, or that we have all these frameworks for moving beyond and or thinking with in different ways. And so I guess a question I have for all of you about kinship beyond the human is part of kinship thinking about proximity and practice in ways that kind of seem like it could work across all 4 fields. I think that I felt like there was proximity and practice in all of your talks, although Juno's yours was the hardest for me to do that with in a certain way. But when we think about forms of care, whether it's nice care or murderous care, what ways do proximity and practice kind of inform relationality? And I think Jacinta's question was actually kind of asking that as well about kin selection. And if we moved away from just thinking about biological kinship or cultural kinship, if we thought about proximity and practice, what would that do? And I guess one leading question I would just add to that would be, for me, it feels like it's a way out of some of these questions that when you're a non-biological anthropologist, it seems like biological anthropologists are often tying themselves into knots, trying to understand why a behavior makes sense because it doesn't make people have more babies, or any kind of animal. And if you did proximity practice and care, like, those things make a lot more sense than just saying it's about having more offspring. So those are the questions I'm going to throw out there, and hopefully we can all have conversations. And Juno, would you be willing?
No, actually, I'm curious what you're...
Okay. Or, Kevin.
All right.
Oh, yes, get your microphone.
And it's on. Okay. Proximity, practice, and care. Okay, so you took a little dig at us biologists there by saying that we twist ourselves into knots. And
not always. I just want to know.
Not always, right? Well, I'd say that there's a reason we do this. You know, I think this view of trying to understand, especially animal behavior, from the point of view of fitness maximizing agents has led to has been incredibly successful, you know, and understanding...
It's had success.
Understanding, you know, why different animals behave so differently in different species. And it's just our first starting point, you know? You know, it's our first starting point because it's been successful, but it's not always successful. We know that natural selection is not the only way in which evolution works, and we know that natural selection is not a perfect process. So it's just, you know, being a little bit better than the alternative. Yeah, I guess I would just end there. I don't know. Was there another? I forget the rest of your question.
Kinship. What's kinship?
What is kinship? Pedigrees and phylogenetic trees. To me, you know, I think it's fine that different disciplines want to investigate a phenomenon in different ways with different definitions, but I'm a big fan of just being clear about when I'm talking about kinship, this is what I mean, and it's perfectly great that we have these sort of things where different people in different disciplines who have different conceptions of kinship can try to get together and find some common ground. But I don't think that means we need to sort of muddle our definitions. Let's just have our own definitions and look for common ground between these things that we're going to keep semantically clear.
Okay, so given my own personal intellectual genealogy, I feel like I've been primed to be wary of biological anthropology in particular, so especially associated with Evo-Devo, right, evolutionary development, because of, you know, coming out first as a feminist before anything, that to have suspicion around everything being about mating, right? And so when you're giving your talk, I found myself thinking, oh, this diagram shows me this feminist idea that sisterhood is powerful, or that it's like the alpha male is not the dominant father or sire of these beings. It's like these you know, chimps who are pretending to not be the alpha to hang out, you know, and that they're the ones who then sire, you know. So then I just like share this because I wonder how much the science wars of the 70s are of the past, and how much coevolution has shifted the conversation so that it is the way of thinking across the biological sciences that then infiltrates
than how we think of biology and society today. I really do wonder if that kind of, Evo-Devo is out of fashion, and that there is more emphasis on co-evolution and collaboration. And I also do wonder to what extent, it's like Carl Woozy's pushing of biological phylogeny changed the way we imagine relations is not like so hierarchical, but as like, okay, we're all like kind of multicellular beings existing somehow, in this very diverse environment. And I do wonder how much the language of variation and diversity becomes, the Venn diagram that is just like such a comfortable place to be when coming out of, the deep humanities and meeting with the deep sciences.
Yeah, I think that's, I love that. I find that a really great place to explore, like both the sciencey side and the humanities side, the kind of the sweet spot. But I guess I wanted to kind of go on this idea of like proximity and practice, and thinking about like animals and humans, and how, we have like these relationships like with dogs and cats we bring into our home. They're almost like fictive kin, that we bring them into our homes, and they're able to like cross this like nature culture boundary in a way that like in like the Western way of viewing the world, we don't kind of allow other animals to cross that boundary. Like Juno, in your talk, would like, talking about like the colonials saying like, oh no, that gibbon can't be your grandfather, like you have to kill him, and things like that. And that the way we even like, try to view these past, when either view other animals or view like Neanderthals, and I don't know, I guess it's just like, and we're almost like, this colonial way of viewing the world and kind of creating nature culture dynamic. We're still like, that's how we kind of still view the world today. And so I don't know, I guess I'm just thinking about that as something that kind of goes across all of our talks, all of our disciplines, like just this like tension between this. Yeah, anyway, I know that like sociocultural anthropology talks about this a lot, but like as archaeology, I'm just kind of, I don't have that as much of a depth in knowledge, but anyway, that's some of my ideas.
Well, I definitely think I'm guilty of taking the subtitle of this gathering much more seriously than the title of the gathering. So I wasn't thinking as much about kinship. I was thinking about the human and beyond more, but I certainly have been thinking about kinship this afternoon by listening to all of your wonderful papers and the questions. And I love the idea of kinship as proximity and practice, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess I'll take this opportunity to confess this kind of a nascent project that I have, which is to do kinship charts of all the dogs that I'm working with. My impetus for that, and that would include the dog, their canine siblings, and I have lots of information about their siblings and their parents and grandparents and what have you from the files at their training organization. But I'm also really interested in all the humans that these dogs have been involved with, including some that are harder to track down because I only have their last initials because they're inmates in a federal prison, who actually, their part of the training involves getting the labs to be more transferable, meaning to not form kinds of attachments, long-term attachments with people, so they can move from, child to child, or one kid can come up into a testimony box and you can sit with a kid for, 3 hours, and then the brother or sister would come up and do the same thing. And so you think about what that's like for the dogs to be moving from, cell to cell on a, every 2 weeks, and also what that's like, of course, for the inmates who, for whom this is, one of the top jobs in the prison, what everyone really kind of wants to, or a lot of people want to be involved in. But my impetus for this, which is for this kinship project, making kinship charts, is because I am reactive to this. Even though I think it's beautiful and I don't want to disrupt it, on one hand, this idea, dogs are magic, and, dogs have this magical therapeutic effect, and, their presence is immediate and so forth. And I always sort of want to say, dogs are they're working. The dogs are working, and they've been working their whole lives. And not only that, there's an enormous amount of labor that's been put in by humans to produce these kinds of working animals. And I do feel that, I keep wondering, how can I explain to people the dogs are not magic? The dogs are working, and the dogs are stressed, they're under stress sometimes because they're working. And I do think that there's something about sort of doing those kinship charts that's going to help me explain that. And so that does also get away from this idea that kinship is this happy, lovely, affective affair, and more into sort of thinking about the labor that involved in kin work. So I'm thinking more about what is kinship than I was certainly before.
Good. Thank you.
They say if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. So I was just interesting to hear you say that the dogs actually get stressed when they're doing these things. Could you talk a little bit more about why you think that? Because that's not like my naive intuition would say. The dogs who do this, it's not really a job for them because they love it.
Well, Amy brought up a wonderful point that I've been thinking about since our talks, which is to think about the different ways we were speculating in our talks. And I kept thinking about speculation throughout the afternoon. And I will say that I am not I'm actually a proverbial cat person. And so I actually, dogs were quite exotic to me when I started this project. I'd only had one dog of my own, and I'd gotten him about, 8 months or 10 months before I started the project. I think that was good because I had to really start from scratch of trying to figure out, how do you observe a dog? How do you read a dog? And of course, I read a lot, but I also did a lot of trying to figure out who is this dog? What's he doing? And there were some things that, I learned as stress signals, partially from the trainers. And as I said, I think the coworkers are kind of radically not curious about how the dog is feeling, but there are stress signals. There's when a dog drools in massive amounts without the stimuli of food, that is a sign of stress. If a dog licks its paws incessantly, that is a sign of stress. Hal started sort of in some ways going on strike some days when he would refuse to jump out of the SUV in the parking lot in the morning. And there were definitely patterns in terms of, the kinds of things that were less predictable, kinds of interactions that he would have. So he was very good in structured settings like the forensic interview where he could sit for 3 hours. But if he was in a family room meeting with multiple siblings and adults and so forth, the paws, would be licking, or he'd jump off the couch, which he was trained that is an absolute, you never get off the couch, right? So things like that were things I learned, and they were different for each dog, but there were some similarities.
I think we have a question.
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much again for all of your thoughts. Admittedly, this question is coming from a bit of a selfish place, but hopefully other folks will find it meaningful as well. So I teach a class here called Animality and the Human Question. It's really great fun. I begin the semester asking students what they take to be the main difference between humans and animals. And inevitably they will tell me things like its culture, its language, its social organization, its political systems, its dominance. It's the fact that we ask this question, things like that. The meta ones will say that. And the way that I structure my class is, over the 14 weeks, the point that I want to make kind of over and over and over again in different ways is that whatever you take the difference to be, it's political. So, it's political in the sense that it has real material consequences for bodies, right? So which bodies get to be individualized, which bodies get to be laboring bodies, which bodies are compensated, which bodies are unfree. Things like that. But there's also a part of me always in teaching this class that feels like that's a little bit of a cop-out. And that students actually do want me to tell them what the difference is, and I'm always trying to get them to kind of move away from that. So the question to you all that I would love selfishly to hear your thoughts on is, is that how you would do this class? Is that the main message that you would want to leave students with, and if not, which is I'm even more interested in then how do you kind of tackle this question and why?
Just because I have the microphone, I'll just answer very quickly.
Take your time.
So I teach a fairly new course called Talking with Animals, and the exercise that I do on the first day of the class, which gets about sort of cuts the enrollment by by about a third right off the bat. Not my intention, but is if you could be an animal, what kind of animal would you be?
That cuts the enrollment?
Right, and if you could talk to an animal, what would you ask it and why? So there are these kinds of speculative questions, and so it gets me back to a thread I kind of picked up on but didn't really elaborate, which is, and even in answering Kevin's question, I think when you really are thinking about taking animals seriously as ethnographic interlocutors, you have to figure out, you really do have to figure out, how can I learn from this animal? And we're all, thinking about that in various ways. And it does take a certain amount of speculation and imagination, as well as a kind of like real empirical rigor, right? Is like trying to figure out what are the patterns and so forth that you're seeing. So I do think the imagination and speculation is one of the things that's been, for me, the most fun about these questions and teaching and doing this line of research.
Yeah, I guess when I'm thinking, I'm not going to say exactly how I would teach this class, but I guess just like this whole question of, when we're thinking about the separation between what makes humans and animals, that's a question that we're always kind of asking ourselves when we're, what makes us human, really, like the big questions of anthropology, I guess. But in archaeology or in the Paleolithic, we kind of are always asking that question when we look at ourselves and Neanderthals and other closely related hominids. And the thing that really gets, because it is kind of speculative, what happens is it's really just a mirror on how we want to see of ourselves. So like with Neanderthals, for example, whether we think Neanderthals are very smart or very dumb or however they are, it's really more about how we want to view ourselves, and whether we think, oh, maybe it's more politically correct to see Neanderthals as being very smart, and and also even thinking about the interactions between humans and Neanderthals, people don't really want to say okay, maybe we were just maybe we caused the extinction of Neanderthals. Like people don't really want to talk about that because then we have to again view ourselves as for the millionth time as kind of horrible. So I don't know. I guess it's interesting when because we are people and we can't ask the animals to kind of define themselves as different and things like that. It often is just kind of a reflection on ourselves.
Yeah, like you just said, really my discipline, my department at ASU sort of has, the reason I got hired there is because the president gave a bunch of money to these senior faculty so they could do 6 junior hires because the current faculty had convinced them that this question of what makes us human is a really important one. So that's really, I think about that a lot. And sort of, just my straight answer, what I think, and sort of what, from being in this milieu where we're really focused on that. In the past, it was all about cognition, right? But there's 2 other C's you gotta think about. Cooperation, humans are sort of an ultra-cooperative species, but, just going, probably cumulative cultural evolution is the 3rd C. And people more and more nowadays are sort of putting that at the forefront. And the reason they're putting that at the forefront is because it's sort of, you think of something like an iPhone, none of us really understand actually how an iPhone works, right? It's this, so you can get really fancy stuff without really cognition driving it. It's just these small steps. So that's how I would think about that. But it's a very complicated question that takes all different types to solve.
I think in terms of how to think about that class, I'm such a kid member of Donna Haraway's world. I can't pose the question that way because to me it's too human exceptionalist. And it's funny because I'm so down with the primates, but I'm whoa, I'm not invested in the human. I really am not. It's funny because on the other hand, I am really attached to these ideas of coevolution and these long stories of human domestication of other animals. At the same time, I am invested in the human when it comes to the history of colonialism and the histories of dehumanization. So I don't know why both are true for me, but they just are. That on one hand, when thinking of the human, I have to think about histories and legacies of dehumanization. But on the other hand, I'm not personally invested in the human, as I'm much more invested in stories of otherness and variation and science fiction, and it's this wonderful, weird time to think about when there were other kind of hominins out there, and we have no idea, right? And yeah, those kinds of stories are totally the thing I'm interested in. But I really don't like saying, I'm not really into repeating these narratives of humans are so great, So yeah, that's just me. This is me being very crass at the end of the day too.
I kind of want to geek out with you on heroin, not heroin, sorry, that's later, on Haraway, right, gosh, what a slip. So Haraway is really interesting in that I think there are 2 ways you could go with her. I think what probably a lot of us who are doing interspecies work are inspired by. So one is the animal perspectivalism, be curious, think from the, be curious what the cat is thinking, right? Try to get there, and so that raises again the question speculation. But then there's this whole other thing with her companion species and her work with her dogs, and the agility dogs in particular, where she gets into this very abductive, like very empirical kind of way of like, you know, thinking about like what one signal from her produces in her dogs, like, you know, how sharply it turns the corner or something like that, and then how she responds to that. So there's this really interesting way that I think that she's not just like, she's getting us to think about kind of speculation on the one hand, right? But also giving us like a model to do it with. I mean, I find some of her stuff a little bit, you know, partially because the agility world is, you know, the way she thinks about work is, you know, I mean, how many others would think of play or maybe what loving your work model. But I do think there's something really interesting there about thinking with her in different ways about how to take another, at the animal's perspective. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Georgia. I study paleoanthropology. I'm a biological anthropology student here. And I love the breadth of this talk where we have a primatologist here, but then we have a lot of people who study modern humans or Neanderthals. And I'm curious about what especially Dr. Langengraber and Dr. Clark think about the idea of kinship through the hominin fossil record. So how from our most recent living ancestors, the primates, how did that move to us?
Well, I think ancient DNA has just been a very valuable tool, and we're starting to learn more and more. There was really a cool paper that came out a couple of, a year or two ago now, from Svante Paavo and colleagues, where, you know, I did some hand waving to talk about how we thought maybe that there's some reasons to think, but I didn't go over them, about why the last common ancestor of humans and chimps would have lived in male phylopatric, female dispersal groups, and then you sort of need that for Chappé's story of how pair bonding evolved. So, you know, there's a couple sources of evidence from that, like in the ethnographic record, patrilocality is pretty common. If you look in hunter-gatherers, they're much more bilocal, so, you know, males or females staying or going, but even with that bilocality, you find males living more frequently among same-sex kin than you do females. So there's this sort of just watered-down male phylopatry, female dispersal in the type of systems that we think are, you know, the best sort of, as limited as they are, the best sort of analogs we have for the ancestral human condition. But then finally, when it comes to ancient DNA, we've got another like phylogenetic branch where you've got a clear genetic signature of male phylopatry and female dispersal by looking at Y chromosome versus mtDNA variation in Neanderthals. And they're finding the same pattern that I found doing genetics of my chimp variation. So there are tools like that that allow us to more directly, instead of just making inferences from present variation, directly looking at like some forms of kinship. And, you know, we're learning things about the other side of how kinship is so important, how common was inbreeding, you know, and things like that.
Yeah, and inbreeding was more common, I mean, for Neanderthals. Yeah. So, which implies that they had much smaller group sizes, and the archaeological evidence supports that as well. I also think a lot about, like, not even just the role of, like, biological kin, but other kin as well. So especially, like, I mean, when we look at, you know, present day groups, you know, we have very large kinship networks that are not just based on like genetic relationships, and people move. So I mean, and I think that probably, I mean, my hypothesis would be that, especially with modern humans and having like personal ornaments and beads, they have like these, they probably, and showing that they had very, you know, these much larger kind of territories. They're probably have these systems of relationships that are not necessarily like, yeah, based on genetic relationship. That's probably very large. So I think that's a really cool thing that may be emerged at that time. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to take this opportunity to ask the question that I was going to ask at the end of your talk, Kevin, and never got to. So, and in some ways maybe it's more appropriate now. So we obviously have this very long history in science of, you know, declaring humans exceptional on trait X and then slowly walking it back and walking it back and walking it back. And I'm very curious whether you think that the menopause story is, is this the beginning of that unraveling? Or is this yet another case where, like, Ngogo is bizarre? And so, for those of you who are less familiar with Ngogo, the Ngogo chimpanzees have, you know, proven themselves to be different than a lot of other chimpanzee communities. And they're fascinating for that reason, but I'm curious what your opinion is about
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, that's didn't have time to it, but that's like in the paper that this stuff is coming out of. That was like our discussion section, you know. So Ngogo is, so basically, you know, what's happening in Ngogo is that females live longer, you know. They just, in other chimp groups, that just, you don't get females over 50, so you don't see this post-reproductive lifespan. So how representative of like, you know, average chimp evolutionary history are the Ngogo chimpanzees? You know, I think you can make a good argument that the Ngogo chimpanzees are the real chimpanzees. The reason I'd say this is this gets into human, non-human interactions at some of these talks we're talking about today. In all other chimp groups, except one, are declining. You know, they've been declining. So we know that their patterns of survival and longevity can't be representative of the long-term evolutionary history of the species, because there would be no chimps on Earth today, right? They would decline into non-existence. Now, okay, now what is the reason for that? I think there's just a growing body of evidence and acceptance that almost all the major chimp groups that have been studied have been severely impacted by anthropogenic disturbance, and that's why they have such low survival rates. They die like flies from the common cold, from the flu, from things like that. And during the study period that you know, these data are drawn from, we had no known major disease outbreaks. And so, you know, the argument is just basically, you know, if we sort of treated chimps better, and now researchers are doing this, you know, because we know more about how to keep chimps safe from human viruses, that we would probably have seen this much more commonly throughout chimp groups. But that's one answer, you know. Maybe Ngogo is super unusual, because the other side of it would be, you know, maybe things are just unusually good, you know, at Ngogo in a way that is not representative of chimp evolutionary history. We know that we've got good food at Ngogo. We know that there's no leopard predators, although there are significant human predation from hunting. Even though it's a national park, we can't stop all of the hunting. So it's, you know, my answer is not necessarily the correct one. You know, my sort of side of that coin is not necessarily the correct one, but it's one we need more research where we treat, you know, where we take chimp health more seriously, and we'll see who's right. But that'll take 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a good reason we don't have data on this, right, or have recently started to have data. So I feel like that answered the question for chimps, but then the question is, what about other species, right? You know, like I said, is this just a story of a kind of slow unraveling where we're eventually going to end up looking at this as like a spectrum of how long you live?
Yeah, maybe, you know, maybe other mammalian populations, I could give the same answer, and just maybe because we're making these inferences on limited data, right? You're gonna, it's hard to gather enough demographic data these animals don't live in huge groups, so maybe substantial post-reproductive lifespans are not as rare as we thought, but with the data we have now, they're super rare.
I also just want to say it's so great that you're studying this, because it just underscores that, biological anthropology is not about reproduction, but that is great that you're studying menopause.
I had a question that came out of Professor Carr's talk, but I think also ties into Professor Perennius' talk, which was about variations in sort of human natural language in these interspecies encounters. You mentioned the bilingual dog handlers, and I mean, this might not be true, but I guess my assumption is that the dogs are also being trained with verbal cues that they need to recognize, and how that works, and how, does it matter for someone who doesn't speak English or who feels more comfortable in one language that the dog is being spoken? There's all these complex interactions. And also, I guess it occurred to me that there has to be some kind of sense that that it's appropriate to speak to the animal in one language or another, also in the Iban case. I guess I don't know for sure, but presumably the Iban person in the scene speaks to the gibbon in Iban language, and then how do the anthropologists know what's being said? Is there a third person who's interpreting it? It just raised a lot of questions, and I guess it stuck out to me because I spent the summer in Istanbul, where there's lots of street cats, and I heard multiple people say all cats speak Turkish, or they speak Turkish better than other languages or something. So yeah, I would just wonder if you could say more about that and sort of the politics around it.
Yeah, no, I totally feel that domesticated animals totally speak the language. One of my earliest lessons in German was geh auf den Platz, which is go to your place, which is the dog command, because it was repeated so often. But with the two guys, one really prides himself in having become native, spending 12 years with Ibans of various districts, and it was only in this research trip, hanging out with this psychology guy who was kind of like a creepy dude, that he realized that there's this culturally significant idea that he had no idea existed, that he was happily hanging out with Iban people. So it was circumstantial. He was fluent in multiple dialects of Iban. So yeah, and so knowing that guy's personal history, I trust the translation, but who knows? Who knows what happened in the actual interactions? It's because it's completely based on the reporting of these two dudes, So we can surmise and speculate.
Is there another I think there's one more question. And then, oh, yes.
So I'll just say, I'm going to try to contain my response here because there are a couple of things going on. One is, you may remember a couple of times where a worker is ventriloquizing the dog to the child or the client. That happens very regularly, so there's a lot of interesting kind of puppetry work that's going on, Hal's telling you how much he cares, or, what have you. So there's quite a lot of that which coexists with this really interesting way in which the human workers are helping to manufacture the experience of immediacy. So one example, now of course hand gestures are functional as well, but there's a real effort to get the workers to move from any kind of verbal command to a much more subtle gesture, so sit or, up or, to get on the couch and what have you, which really makes, or for example, wheelchair greetings, which are practiced over and over and over again. Ad nauseum. I mean, the human handlers and the dogs go over that over and over again so that it looks like the dog is greeting the person in the wheelchair perfectly and wanting to get right next to them and put their paws politely in the person's lap. So there's a lot of work in both regards, and these linguistic differences, right? So the bilingual handler is still learning to do the hand gestures and relying upon them a lot, but is doing the translating work in the other language. So there's both things going on.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My question is kind of for all of you. I've heard it's kind of mean because it puts you on the spot, but I'm curious, like, in light of what we're doing here, are there ways that hearing the different talks across the different subfields have shaped or like changed how you think about your research?
I mean, I'll just say I've always, it's such a pleasure to be on this panel in a four-field event, particularly as, I guess, as an alum of this program. I mean, I have envy of every project on this. You know, I think I'd love to do that, or I'd love to, you know, like this is just so. Just I think general inspiration. I'll have to think about how it's going to change the way I go about my work, but I have no doubt it will influence my work going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, I mean, I think this is really wonderful because, I mean, I took classes across the fields in graduate school, but now I feel like I'm getting kind of more off in my own world. But like, even like with Juno, you're like, I mean, with us, the biological and anthropological and archaeological side, we're like, why are humans the best ever? And you're like, wait, I don't even care about humans. So I just think it's like, it's really great to like, you know, get together and talk about this kind of stuff and then think about that with my own research. And then thinking about certain things like, yeah, like what's happening with you know, this grandmother hypothesis that has been so, you know, that's so prevalent in human evolution, and thinking about like stuff like you said, like it's group size, you know, like so I've been fascinated by group size for a long time, so just thinking about the role that plays in kind of allowing for these other kinds of relationships, that's certainly going to be something I keep in mind.
Okay, first of all, I'd just like to make a little correction to the record. I don't think humans are the greatest ever. That obviously is dachshunds. But I think, you know, when I say, you know, it's more like humans are a spectacular outlier on this planet in terms of their ecological dominance, in the same way that ants are. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you know, like the biomass of ants and humans. Everything else is rounding error, you know. So it's just, I'm just interested in explaining this spectacular outlier. And unfortunately, there's only one of them left, so that makes our traditional tools. Like if we had a lot more close, like if Neanderthals were still around, Denisovans, Flores, you know, all these other hominins, you'd be able to better use our traditional tools in biology of the comparative method of doing. So we're sort of left with spinning stories like I did today to a certain extent for this unusual trajectory. But to get to the actual question is, you know, I guess I'm pretty siloed in my thinking. You know, like I work in a discipline where there's rules to the game of what is knowledge, but that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate just going back to my roots, you know, just appreciating that there's a different way, even though it's not going to no, I'm not going to cite you in my next paper, you know, but it's just cool and interesting getting information, different ways of thinking about the world, and that's still fulfilling and rewarding and worthwhile, even if there's not maybe some super direct connection with you two, like there might be with us too, you know?
You know, like with the first two papers, I really enjoyed seeing a different kind of narrative of domestication, right? With like the dog-human relationship and the literal household and how that's changed with different species of hominin. And you know, throughout your talk, I was just reflecting on my own, you know, like personal history of how much I find inspiration in primatology, but I've also recognized how my interests have changed too. You know, where I will continue to keep abreast with primatology, but I'm actually really interested in the story of human evolution and coevolution when it comes to dairying. And I'm like so into, you know, lactase persistence, and I'm finding myself very inspired by ARC, actually, in BioArc. But it's more of, I still really do feel personally invested in being a four fields anthropologist, you know, and I think it's because I think it's actual personal interest, you know, that it's the interest that's driving this, when at this point I can do whatever I want, you know, like technically. And yet I keep coming here. Why do I keep coming here? You know, like, why do I keep coming into four fields? I think because it's such a generative spot where so many ideas are circulating. And I think I'm just still magnetically drawn to it. Yeah.
I think that's a perfect note on which to bring this event to an end. So let me begin first by thanking everyone for attending today, with a special thanks to our 4 guest speakers and to the moderators. A special thanks to Julie Winningham for coordinating. And to channel Liz Roberts' definition, if that's what you were throwing out as one. I want to thank everyone here and online for participating in this effort to practice four-field anthropology in proximity to each other, with care, respect, and a collaborative spirit. So thank you so much for being here, and please join us in refreshments. Thank you.